from my house to yours, a very Merry Christmas, a Happy Holidays, a Happy Yule, a Happy Hanukkah, a most Merry Kwanzaa, a Happy Festivus for the rest of us, and a most glorious Posthumus, or whatever else you decide to celebrate. It's Christmas time in these parts, and I'm just cleaning up the remnants of the kids opening all their Christmas presents, so I'll be at it a while. But as I stoop and grab paper and thrust it into a bag, I'm sure that you can get cozy by the fire while you join me for some wonderful Christmas tales here on a very special Christmas Cozy Horror with me, Dr. Plague. So, let's get started, because we have quite a few holiday tales to tell today. We're going to go ahead and get this one out of the way right out front, because, wow, it is one of my darkest tales, never mind Christmas holiday or otherwise, and one of my most divisive tales in the realm of whether the protagonist deserved what they got or not. But I'm sure some of you old heads that have been here for a while know exactly what story I'm talking about. So, kick back, relax, and let's hear my spin on a favored holiday tradition of giving naughty children a lump of Santa's coal. When you read this story, you may think that my punishment was fitting. When you read this story, you may believe that I got exactly what I deserve. But what you should remember is that my actions were the actions of a child, actions that were judged by someone of a near godlike stature and levied against an 8-year-old girl who may not have fully grasped the consequences of her actions. I believe I should have been punished. I even believe I should have been punished harshly, but I do not believe I should have been made to suffer for 30 years of my life over the actions of an 8-year-old girl. It sits even now on my mantelpiece, glaring at me like some disquieting idol, and even as I sit in my cold apartment, I can feel its hate. I'm rambling. Let me start at the beginning. When I was 7 years old, I had the worst year of my life. My mother died on Christmas Day after a long battle with cancer. My father was always at work, always busy, never had time for me, which meant my mother and I had always been close. When she'd gotten sick, I had immediately spent every waking moment I could at her side in the hospital. Dad was busy, too busy for his dying wife or his hurting daughter, and it was up to me to watch her slip away over the course of 9 months. I was there in her room when she died, pushed up against the wall as the doctors and nurses tried their best to revive her. By the time my father got there, I had been sitting and crying by my mother's deathbed for 2 hours. Mom had been my sole guardian, my staunch caretaker, and her absence had left me numb and spiteful. I was mad at many things in my life, but above all else, I was mad at Santa Claus. As children, we believed Santa to be some kind of all-powerful totem of the holidays. If you write a letter to Santa, he will bring you your heart's desire. He will make any wish a reality. As adults, we know better, but as children, we believe that Santa is the genie from Aladdin mixed with Jesus Christ himself, and his powers around the holidays are unwavering and unarguable. In my 7-year-old mind, if I had asked him to save my mother and he hadn't, then it was because he didn't want to. This turned me into a mean and spiteful 8-year-old. My father brought a new woman home, one of his secretaries from the office named Cindy. She was sleeping in my mother's bed, moving her things around, and replacing my mother in almost every way. Looking back through the lens of time, Cindy was a very nice lady, and if I'd given her a chance, she would have probably made a very good mother for me. Cindy cooked my meals, she cleaned the house, she tried her best to be my friend, and I gave her nothing but hate. My mother, the focal point of my life, had died after all. To have this woman in her house, sleeping in her bed, even wearing her clothes, was an affront. I told her that she was worthless daily, told her that I hated her, told her that she would never even come close to being my mother, and in spite of all that, she tried to love me. They got married 6 months, after my mother died. I spent the first 3 months of their marriage making their lives a living hell. I refused every meal Cindy made me. I destroyed any room I was left alone in, and then lied and said I had no idea how it had gotten that way. I went out of my way to be an inconvenience to her, telling her I needed things for school or would really like this one particular thing in my nicest, sweetest voice, and then disregard or right out refuse to take anything she brought back. Sometimes I would destroy the gifts she gave me right in front of her. When she got me a beautiful dress for fall, a dress I would actually have liked to have worn, I tore it to pieces as she and my father watched, and then stormed to my room and slammed the door. I knew, you see, that I was safe from punishment no matter what I did. Father never cared what I did, as long as I didn't do it in his office, and since Mother had always been responsible for the house and the children, he expected Cindy to take me in hand, a task she was unsuited for. Cindy was more prone to tears than screams in the face of my misbehavior, but something was happening that even I hadn't foreseen, and it changed my antics forever. In October, Cindy became pregnant. By November, it was official, and my father was ecstatic at the idea of another child. This confused me, because he'd never shown the slightest interest in me at any point. Cindy was immediately the center of his universe. He hired a maid to clean and cook and look after me. I don't remember her name, but we went through 3 maids by December because of my antics. I made their lives a living hell, and whatever my father was paying them was clearly not enough to put up with me. The last one, I think her name was Rosemary, didn't speak English, but had a way about her that told me she was not going to leave because of a brat like me. I can remember being picked up in those 2 large arms and carried to my room as I kicked and bit and screamed. She would deposit me on the floor and lock my door so I couldn't escape and ruin her work. She knew how the house worked, too, it seemed, and she knew that my timeouts wouldn't be commented on by Cindy or my father. By December 1st, I'd had enough of Cindy and her constant attention. The baby only made me hate her more, and as people continued to shower her with attention, my hatred burned hotter and hotter. Rosemary started keeping a closer eye on me as Cindy's pregnancy continued, but she really needn't have bothered. I wasn't what you call a planner, and when my chance came, I almost missed it. Looking back on it as an adult, I realized just how cruel I was at that moment. Cindy wanted nothing but a child that would love her, something I was never going to do, and the baby was her way of making my mother's house a home as well. I couldn't have that. I was at the top of the stairs, playing with dolls, when Cindy started up with a basket of laundry. Normally that would be Rosemary's job, but the maid had caught a cold, and my father had given her the week off, so she didn't make Cindy sick. Cindy was not supposed to be doing chores. She was under strict orders to be taking it easy and not straining herself. But she was trying to pick up a little, so Rosemary wouldn't have such a heavy workload when she came back. She'd come tottering up the stairs, basket obscuring her view, and I suddenly had a plan to make this all go away forever. I picked up my Barbie dream car and placed it precariously on the top step where I knew she'd put her foot down. I was young, but don't think for a second that I was naive. I knew a fall down the stairs would likely kill her, and if it didn't, it would likely get rid of the baby forever. She was midway up when a voice in my head tried to talk me out of it. "You shouldn't hurt her. It's not okay to hurt people." My conscience always spoke to me in my mother's voice, but I was doing this for her. Couldn't she see that? "You're going to risk killing her and her baby because of something your father did?" I didn't care. I hated her too much. "You're going to get in a lot of trouble for doing it." That made me think for a moment, but by then, it was already too late. Her house slipper came down on the car, and I watched her fall backwards down the stairs with a loud scream. The clothes went flying everywhere, and as she fell, I saw her wrap her arms protectively around her belly. She curled in a ball as she fell, and when she hit the first step, I knew she'd broken something. She hit 3 more steps before coming to rest at the bottom, still hugging her stomach as she lay crying, the laundry basket covering her as she came to rest. There she lay in a puddle of clothes and carpet, and from my vantage point, I could see the first thin trickles of blood as they coursed from underneath. The ambulance arrived in time to save her. Dad had been at the office when Rosemary had called him. She had come running in about 5 minutes after Cindy had fallen and called the ambulance after making sure I was okay. She sat with Cindy at the bottom of the stairs, cradling her head and talking to her in that too-fast Spanish she always used when it was just the two of them. I sat at the top of the stairs, surveying my handiwork, but Rosemary wouldn't let me come down the couple of times I tried. Rosemary was never fooled about what had happened, and she always looked at me with secret knowledge the few more times we had reason to be together. Dad beat the ambulance home, but only just. He rode in the ambulance with Sydney, thanking Rosemary for coming over so suddenly, and left me with the housekeeper while he went to go see about his new wife and child. Rosemary started dinner, and I played in my room, and sometime later, after dinner I think, my father came home. He called both of us to the living room, giving Rosemary the honor of joining in the news, and filled us in on Cindy and the baby. He told us that Cindy was going to stay in the hospital for a while. She'd broken several bones and scraped her back up pretty badly, and had possibly injured her spine. The doctors weren't sure how badly she was hurt, but they did say that she had lost the baby. Rosemary cried a little, but I didn't. I had wanted this to happen, but now that it had, all I could feel was numbness. I had killed something. Not a bug or anything, but a real person, and I was no longer sure how I felt about it. I left before he was done talking, but he didn't seem to mind. How quickly things would change. Dad went to the hospital early the next morning. He was on his way out the door when I reminded him that he'd promised to take me to see Santa. It was a promise he had made days ago, a promise I believed he'd forgotten. But when I reminded him of it, I put enough whine on my voice to make it sound like it was something I'd been looking forward to. I knew there was no Santa, of course, back when I thought I knew so much, but I knew that the mall would be crowded, and it would force him to spend time with me. At the end of the day, I guess all I wanted was my father to show me that he cared. He asked Rosemary to take me instead, and he went off to see Cindy in the hospital. We rode to the mall in the town car, as a palpable silence hung between us. "What are you going to ask St. Nicholas for?" she asked conversationally. "There is no Santa Claus, silly. I'm too old to believe in such things." She was quiet for a few seconds, before, almost whispering, "You are very wrong." "What?" I asked, shocked out of my pouty huff. No adult had ever contradicted me, not even my mother, and to be contradicted by the help was just unthinkable. "I said you are very wrong. Just because you do not believe in something doesn't mean it isn't so. It matters not whether you believe in a thing or not, only whether or not it believes in you." She spoke matter-of-factly in her thick Spanish accent. I turned away, ignoring her and pretending she didn't exist. I was a spoiled brat, a naughty child that needed a lesson in how the world worked. I didn't know it then, but this lesson would begin sooner rather than later. This lesson would be the only lesson worth learning. We waited in line for an hour and a half. Rosemary had walked me to the middle of the crowded mall, shoppers moving to and fro and families laughing as they moved from shop to shop, all while Christmas music played in the background. Santa's stage had been set up in front of the big fountain in the middle of the mall, and it looked just as goofy and phony as it always did. There was a long snake of children that trailed away from it, curving around like a magic circle. Rosemary sat on a nearby bench and told me to stand in line. "I'm much too old to see him, but if you would receive his judgment, then you must wait." I fidgeted nervously as I waited, throngs of happy families crowding around me, and sighed as the line moved slower and slower. Why was I waiting in this line? I didn't believe in Santa Claus. If Santa was real, he'd have saved my mother. Even if I had still believed, this was just going to be some half-drunk fat guy they'd stuffed into a suit who smelled like kid's pee and barely talked. It was ridiculous to stand here and wait for my turn to sit on this old faker's lap. But despite that, I couldn't force myself to leave. Rosemary's words had somehow moved me, and it felt more like I was waiting for a confession than my turn on Santa's knee. When I finally neared the front of the line, I could see that my assumption had been wrong. This year's Santa was not a fat man with a cloth beard or some homeless man with a tangled mess of hair. He was dressed all in red, and his suit looked homemade as opposed to store-bought. His beard was a fluffy white bulge of soft-looking hair, and on his round little nose sat a pair of tiny spectacles. His boots looked old and battered, his face was a patchwork of laugh lines, and he practically oozed with good cheer and holiday spirit. The elves, teenagers usually dressed in green smocks and pointy shoes, had been replaced with actual little people, and their costumes were perfect to the last detail, from their pointy shoes to their pointy ears. The whole crew made a jolly, happy scene, and I didn't see one child act scared or unsure of the laughing stranger. When it was my turn, however, the mood seemed to change. The elf who came to get me took one look at my face and almost sneered. His happy, laughing face seemed something almost contemptuous, and as he led me to the jolly old man, I was affixed with the laughing eyes and greeted by the rosy voice. But his face changed as the elves had. He wasn't mad. I saw no anger on his face, but he became almost mournful, disappointed. He allowed me into his lap, and I was surrounded by the smells of old cinders, gingerbread, the woodsy animal smell of reindeer, and freshly fallen snow, but his eyes were still that of a disappointed parent. It was as though he were ashamed to see me in my current state. "Hello, Abigail." How do you know my name?" I said, startled for a moment. He smiled that slightly troubled smile and answered, "Because I'm Santa Claus. It's my job to know all the children." "Of course," I said, sighing a little. If this guy wanted to play his part, then I'd play along, I guess. "Well, then, you probably know what I want for Christmas already." "I do, but I know you're only getting one thing this year." I laughed. I couldn't help it. He was just so full of crap. My tree at home was stacked with presents, and I knew enough to know that everything I'd asked Dad for was there. This man didn't know me after all, then. If I wanted something, I got it, and that was all there was to it. I wondered briefly if Rosemary had told him to scare me a little. He pressed a small box into my hand then. "I have a present for you, something very special. It's something we only give to certain children." It was a small red box with a simple bow on top. It's about the size of a ring box, and when I touched it, I could feel a small electric charge run through me. I nearly dropped it, but I managed to hold on to it as my surprise turned into malaise. A token gift with no real meaning from a mall Santa with no real power. Yes, I'm sure it's wonderful and unique, and I won't see a dozen or so of them in the parking lot on the way out," I said as I hopped off his lap. "Merry Christmas, Santa," I said as I walked back towards the exit. "Merry Christmas, Abigail," he said, almost too low for me to hear, and then he was off greeting the next child as I left. I didn't open the box that day. I honestly forgot about it until Christmas Eve, and though I must have seen it under the tree 1,000 times, I didn't remember bringing it out of the car. Rosemary was silent on the car ride home, but she kept shooting glances at my present, and then looking away quickly before she thought I would notice. She probably expected me to rip it open and see what Santa had given me, but I didn't care what it was. I kept thinking back on the whole experience and couldn't help but feel unnerved. He had just been a mall Santa after all, but something about him had seemed like more than that. He had almost seemed like the real Santa to me. The days came and went. Dad spent more and more time at the hospital with Cindy, something that he'd never done for Mom, and Rosemary and I found ourselves more and more often spending time together at the house. We didn't suddenly become friends or anything, but many afternoons were spent with me on the couch watching TV and her in the kitchen cooking or cleaning the house and singing to herself. She was a patient woman, Rosemary, and after a few days of making life hard for her, I stopped completely. I would just sit listlessly on the couch or lie on my bed and read, and now it almost seems like I was waiting for something to happen. On Christmas Eve, something did. Rosemary was staying the night, Dad at the hospital with Cindy as usual, and if she hadn't been there, I would likely be dead. The fire marshal's report says that at 1:35 a.m., the outlet plugged into the tree shorted out and set fire to the large pile of presents beneath it. Rosemary was asleep in the guest bedroom when the fire started, and upon smelling the smoke, she woke me up, and the two of us left the house as the living room blazed. We dialed 911 from the neighbor's house, but by the time the fire trucks arrived, it was too late. Rosemary and I watched the townhouse burn down, watched the house collapse in on itself, and watched in silence as everything I'd ever known was consumed. I lost everything that night. My clothes, the pictures of Mom, the dresser she had made me, all the cards she'd written me, all the books she'd ever read to me as I drifted off to sleep. All of it was ash in the December wind, and when Rosemary wrapped me in a hug, I didn't feel capable of returning it. I was in shock for quite some time, and when they brought me to the hospital, my father finally came to check on me. He didn't stay long once the doctor told him I was unharmed. which left Rosemary and I alone in the ER room. The police and the firefighters came to talk to me then. The fire was deemed an accident, and everything in the house a complete loss. These weren't the words they used with me, of course. They were sympathetic and told me the local charity was collecting clothes, food, and toys for my family in our time of need. One of the firefighters also told me with a smile that not everything had been lost in the fire. He reached into his coat and handed me a small package that had been sitting under the tree for nearly a week. The small red package with the simple bow that the mall Santa had pressed into my hand. I held the box for a while. It was completely undamaged by the fire. Not even the shiny ribbon used to make the bow had been burned. But when I looked at it, I already knew this was no normal gift. Rosemary was looking at me as I held it, and she seemed to know too what I would find when I opened the box. "Might as well open it, child. Holding off won't make it any better." Inside the box was a simple lump of coal. I've had it tested several times over the years. It's a lump of pure coal, unrefined, unproduced, made with what I now think must be pure magic. It left no stains inside the box. It left no residue on my hands. And over the years, I found it to be indestructible. It was the only thing I received that Christmas. And, to be honest, it was enough. My life was never the same after that day. Cindy was brought to our new home in January. It wasn't as grand as our old house, not even close, but it was ours. Father's time at the hospital had meant that his business had suffered, and so did his finances. Cindy's medical stay was costing him a fortune, so she had had to come home. My medical expenses were costing him quite a lot, and I hadn't stayed long in the hospital either. Rosemary still cooked and cleaned, but Father seemed always on the verge of firing her. He didn't want to. He felt she had changed his daughter somehow, but we simply didn't have the money to pay her. Cindy needed Rosemary, however. Cindy was still nearly catatonic, even after weeks in the hospital. Something had snapped in her after losing the baby, and now she did little more than stare at the wall or soil herself. She would take food if you fed her, and she would drink water if you dribbled it on her mouth, but she didn't move, and she wouldn't talk. Rosemary would often sing to her, something soft in Spanish, as she combed her hair or bathed her, and Cindy seemed to like it when Rosemary was there. It didn't matter, though. Rosemary had bills to pay, and ultimately needed a job as much as anyone. 2 weeks after Cindy came home, Father had to let Rosemary go. I met her at the door and begged her to stay. I had come to like her in the time after the fire. We had come to an almost friendly place. My rage and anger seemed meaningless now, and I didn't want her to leave. She was often the only person in the house who seemed real to me, alive, and without her, the house would seem so empty. She bent down on one knee and favored me with a smile. "I know things seem hard now, but you must be strong. You have no idea how much worse things will become." "How do you know?" I asked, no anger in my words, only a child's terrible curiosity. Rosemary closed her eyes then. "When I was a girl, I had a younger sister named Maria. She was so beautiful, and everyone loved her. I was so very plain-looking, common, and I was angry that my little sister got so much more attention than me. So one day, I pushed her into a well. She drowned in that well, drowned as I stood and watched. And when they found her, they asked me what I knew. I told Father I knew nothing, and it was believed to be an accident. That Christmas I received my own red box, and—" She reached into her apron then and pulled out a large black rock, just like the one I had upstairs in my room. "I received my punishment from him. My father's livelihood was his farm and his ranch, and in the next year I saw his cows die of sickness. A flood killed my mother and siblings. His crops dwindled, and his money dried up. By the end of his life, he was a hired hand for a rancher who had been his greatest rival, and after a horse threw him and killed him, I left for America with nothing but the clothes on my back. I do what I can now, in my old age, to make amends for the sins of my youth. You must do the same." I never saw her again after that, but she had been right. My father couldn't turn his business around and was forced to sell his assets. With no one to take care of her, I was forced to be Cindy's caregiver. and I tried my best to use it as an opportunity to make amends for what I'd done. Father sank into depression and started drinking. Who would blame him for drinking, I suppose? He was a failed businessman, a dead first wife, a cold daughter, and a current wife who was little better than a vegetable. He would fly into rages, and when he did, no one was safe from his screaming mouth or his flailing fist. I could forgive him the drinking. I could forgive him his rages. But the night he climbed into my bed when I was 13, I decided I would never forgive him for that. 3 years later, I would leave home forever, unable to take the abuse any longer. The coal, however, followed me. No matter where I went, no matter what I did, it would always be waiting for me, a reminder of my sins. It's been 20 years now since that Christmas. I live in a dingy apartment with neighbors who are either too stoned or too wrapped up in their own problems to notice me. I've never had a job longer than a year, or a relationship that didn't end with me filing a police report. I've been banned from the local mall, several local malls, many times for many reasons, but the most common one is accosting mall Santas, looking for the real one amongst the imposters. I've never found him. I've never found anyone but the sots or the creeps I spoke of when I was in my childish absurdity. I do see him sometimes, though. It's always in December, always as the first snow falls. I'll be on the street, walking to work, or just walking to get out of my apartment, and there he is on the other side of the street, or at the end of the block. He's dressed in the same red suit and cap, the same scuffed old boots, and the same little glasses perched on his nose. He never says a word, just lays a finger on the side of his nose, and smiles his sad smile at me. I always run to him, always try to get to him before he disappears, but when I'm done dodging traffic or knocking people out of my way, he's always gone, and I'm always left crying as people stare at me like I might be crazy. While the cold does curse my life, it also gives me one gift, if you can call it a gift. When I was 13, right after my father slipped into bed with me for the first time, I waited until he was asleep and walked to the cabinet where I knew he kept his gun. I took out his revolver, made sure it was loaded, and put it to my temple. If he'd done it once, I knew he'd do it again, and I wasn't going to live in a home where that was my life. I closed my eyes that were dry as the desert, and steeled myself to pull the trigger. The cylinder turned and the hammer fell, but the gun did not report. I pulled the trigger 5 more times, but nothing happened. I put fresh bullets in the gun and tried again, but nothing happened. Finally, I just put the gun away and slept on the couch. When I was 15, I tried to jump off the roof of the house. I jumped head first from the roof over the driveway. I wanted my death to be assured. I didn't want to wake up in the hospital with a broken neck and no way to escape my father. Cindy was still alive then, still catatonic, but still alive. And though my death would leave her at his mercy, I couldn't find it in myself to care anymore. I just wanted the hurting to stop. I came to on the lawn with a sore back and a scraped up bottom. I've tried many other methods through the years, but none of them work. Someone always finds me. Something always fails. The ambulance always gets there in time. My life is always saved. Whatever magic the coal has that ruined my life also helps preserve it. Of this I'm quite sure. Whatever lesson I am learning from my sin is one that will go on for a good long time. I'm writing this tale in hopes that it might save others from my fate. Let your children know, let your friends know, that the songs aren't just songs. We threaten our children with coal, but we don't understand it. We have forgotten that Santa doesn't just reward the just. We sing the songs about how he sees you when you're sleeping and knows when you're awake, but we have forgotten that these things are fact. The coal sits on my desk as I write this, a black-hearted reminder of the hasty actions of a child. And no matter what I do, it follows me forever. So never forget that which sees you when you're sleeping. Remember always that he knows when you're awake. For he knows when you've been bad or good. So be good, for goodness sake. As the coal burns, the coal gives heat. So too does the heat destroy. Coal can sustain a fire, and a fire can be a tool of destruction. As you act in haste, so too does the fire, and never doubt that his fire will scour that which you hold dear. So when you lay down to sleep, pray for only the joys of Christmas. Pray for peace and goodwill towards men. Pray that you never feel the jagged edge of coal in your stocking. Oh, look at that. You're still here. You never know who's going to leave when that's the first show you've got in the barrel there. I'd like to say that it gets a little less dark from here, but no, it really doesn't. But, hey, it's a horror show, so that's what we're here for, is that good Christmas horror. As you sit around and wait for Christmas dinner to be served, or wait for the kids to finish opening their presents. And, speaking of more Christmas horror, let's go right along into the next one, which is a bit of a fan favorite because it's one of the earlier works about our favorite holiday boogin. I'm speaking, of course, of the Green Man. So, sit back, relax, and hear a little bit more about the Winter Lord. December is a time of cheer and goodwill for most of the world. People exchange gifts, sing songs, houses are decorated, big meals are eaten with friends and family. Molly didn't learn about any of this until she left the village. She'd spent her first happy year away from home, getting odd sidelong stares and hearing repressed mumbles as she asked about their preparations and inquired about their sacrifices. No one seemed to know him, which filled Molly with hope. No one knew what it was like to live in the shadow of his fear, which made Molly hope that she had escaped him. 10 years later, Molly had a home of her own, with a husband to keep her warm on cold nights, and children to fill her heart with joy. She'd worked hard to leave behind all the traces of her old life, moved to America, found a place where she could forget the darker things that still lurked in the old world. Molly's home was covered in lights every December, snowmen standing sentry on the lawn, and her home was filled with the smells of cakes and cookies and the laughter of happy children. It was Christmas Eve again, and Molly was hard at work in the kitchen. Jake was 10, Hannah 6, and Molly had been baking and cooking all day in preparation for tomorrow's dinner. Joseph's family would be coming over to exchange presents, and she wanted this meal to be the best yet. The children were preparing for bed, brushing teeth and washing faces, and as the last of their preparations went into the stove, Molly sat down and sighed happily. Everything was done. Everything was ready. And now it was time to relax before Joseph came home and, "Mama, we're ready for our story." Molly sighed, but it was a happy sigh. She'd forgotten about the time. She scratched the bandage on the back of her hand as she made her way to the back of the house. The blood stains on it stood out a little, and when Joseph asked her about it, Molly had told him that she'd burned her hand on the stove. Maybe, she thought, she should tell him what had really happened. The more Molly thought about it, the more she knew that she wouldn't know where to begin. The children were nestled all snug in their beds when Molly arrived, and she took her seat in the big wooden rocker in the middle of the room, asking them what story they wanted to hear. "Three bears?" she asked. "Mama, that's a baby story," Hannah exclaimed, with deep indignation. Mickey Mouse Christmas, maybe?" "Pfft, that book's lame," Jake said, making full use of his new big kid attitude he seemed to have acquired when he turned 10. "Well, what do you want to hear?" Molly asked, rubbing the bridge of her nose as she felt a headache developing. "We want to hear a scary story," said Jake. I want to hear a Christmas story," said Hannah, "that's maybe a little scary." Molly tried to quash her frustration. She was just thinking that she didn't know any scary Christmas stories, but she realized that wasn't true. Molly knew an absolutely terrifying Christmas story. A story that was made all the scarier because it was true. A story made all the more frightening because Molly had lived it. "You want a scary story, do you?" she asked, both leaning forward beneath their covers. "I've got a scary story, if you'd like to hear it." Molly asked the question coyly, knowing they would want to hear. Her children were not the children Molly had grown up with. They were not children of the cold and snow. They wanted to be scared, but but they had no clue what genuine fear was. They didn't know what it meant to shiver in the corner as you hear the green one tromp down the street. They'd never felt the terrible cold that signaled the end of someone you loved. Molly prayed they never did, but maybe a taste wouldn't hurt them too badly. Molly almost felt the cold creeping up her legs as she began, returning to a time when she had known the fear she hoped to instill. Mama's not from here. Unlike Daddy, Mama was not born in this great country. Once, she lived in a town called Ingsfield. Ingsfield was a small farming town, far away from the hustle and bustle of the city. We had no cars, no phones, no televisions, and our lights came from the candles and the fire we cooked over. Our town was a simple one, our ways just as simple, and that was how we liked it. When autumn began, we began preparing for his arrival. "Whose arrival, Mama?" Hannah asked, her voice a little excited. "His arrival," Molly intoned. "The coming of the Winter Lord." "Whose—" "Hush, children, and listen." Hannah fell silent again, and Molly continued. Harvest was always a time of celebration. The whole town worked together to bring in the bounty of the farmland. The livestock were brought from the fields, and knives were sharpened in preparation for the slaughter. The meat was salted and packaged for storage. Food was stored and canned and placed in cellars for the long winter ahead. And then, when everyone was set aside for winter, we put our excess together and prepared the end of autumn feast. On the last week of what you would call November, we held an autumn fair. It was always held on the village green, a long few acres near the town hall, and was always highly anticipated. There was music at the bandstand, dancing on the pavilion, tables laid with food and drink, games for children, prizes to be won. The celebration went on for a week. Some people celebrated all 7 days, and only slept when their bodies demanded it. The people seemed to dance and play all the joy and warmth out of themselves during that week. Many knew that the next 4 months would be hard, knew that they might not see another autumn festival. So they lived a whole year in 1 week, and the whole town seemed to shrink when it was over. On December 1st, we began to feel the real chill of winter. That was when we built the altar. They were both wide-eyed now, their questions squashed for the moment. She drew them in with her story, painted a picture of idyllic life she'd once known, and now came the time for the real story to begin. It was time to show them a place where Santa Claus didn't stop, a land where Christmas trees brought no joy. These symbols would not save you from the Winter Lord, and it was time they knew what waited in the cold and the gloom. The town of happy revelers changed overnight. Now, happy faces red with drink became somber and knowing. They went to the quarry and brought the altar stone, the stone they'd used many and many a, still red with the dried leavings of last year's unfortunate chosen. They spent the week stacking stones and adjusting them just right, so their shape would please him when he came. After a week of stacking and preparing the altar, the offering was chosen, and the contents inspected. The Lord's offering, the last crop planted that year, was harvested, and the vegetables and grain were inspected for flaws that might anger him. Once that was done, 2 calves were chosen and brought forth to be inspected for defects and weaknesses. These were usually the 2 calves who'd taken home the best in show at the autumn fair, and their owners always looked sad, knowing that those 2 would never grow to adulthood, would never know the fear of the sharpened knives next year. Only then, after these things were chosen, did the town choose the real sacrifice. They were shivering now, and why not? Could Molly not feel the coldness in the room? That frigidity couldn't be dispelled by a fire or a blanket. Its coldness was an old one, as old as time and as bleak as the tundra. It had been felt by the first man who shivered in his cave on a winter night. It was the coldness that man felt when the winter lord came to his cave and offered him a better way, a darker way. Cold as they were, Molly had their attention. Both were huddled beneath their blankets, shuddering from either cold or fear, but they could not look away. She saw that Hannah wanted her to stop, wanted it all to stop before the story got really scary. Molly could also tell that Jake wished he had never asked for a scary story at all. There was magic in this tale that neither had ever known, making it all the more tantalizing. But they would know of him, even if the knowledge drove them mad in its knowing. The townspeople never chose their sacrifice. They would not have had the nerve to cut their own flock. The mark always chose for them. The mark would appear on the door of the sacrifice, a circle of blood with 3 slashes through it, and the sacrifice would feel it burned into their skin on the back of their hand one night as they slept. Its appearance was unquestioned by any and all, though some sacrifices did claim falseness. I remember the mark being contested only once, and the man's protest made little difference. He owned the biggest farm and the most land within the village. He claimed that his son had made the mark so the father would be put out of his way and his inheritance would be had. His son claimed no part in this, but it mattered not. The farmer had been chosen in the traditional way, and thus he was locked away until the night of the sacrifice. He screamed when that night came, but his screams didn't last long. Some went quiet, some went screaming, but they always went the same way. They went with the cold. At sunset, the snow began to blow in. Sometimes the snow would come before him, but the snow that preceded him was always thick and unforgiving. Snow from the mountaintops that killed if you stayed in it too long. The snow blew and the wind howled, and as the darkness settled over the town, we heard him approach. He came a horse, the steel-shod hooves cutting through the ice as it solidified on the dirt streets of our small town. I remember peeking one year when I was tiny, before my mother saw me and pulled me beneath the sill. I saw him, mounted on his horse. His skeletal horse was thin as a rail, its legs like sticks with frost for skin, and its eyes shone red with the fires of hell as its mane of shadow rippled like thistle from its scaly head. As terrible as he was beautiful when put against his rider. His rider, the Winter Lord, the Green Man, he who accepts the flesh. Though he was man-shaped, that was where the resemblance ended. He came dressed in armor of the deepest forest green, a cape of blue trailing behind him. His cape was ragged, covered in old red stains and stiff with frost, and as it trailed out, you could hear the ice on it break as it snapped in the wind. He held a 2-handed axe in one clawed hand, and whether those claws were armor or his own hands, no one knew. The axe was monstrous, its edge ever dripping with the blood of his victims. He held it down at his side, so it dragged the snow and left a red trail behind him. On his head sat a helmet topped with magnificent antlers, and charms and sigils of unknown meaning hung from those horns. No one had ever seen his face and lived. He kept it hidden beneath his helmet, but his eyes were as red as his horse's. If they fell upon you and met your own, he would raze your hovel to the ground and seek out your bloodline until it was expunged from the earth. He came to town on the 24th of December, a day which had some significance for him. With him came a mighty blizzard. It would cover the town and hide his deeds from sight as he went about his business. There were some who held the idea that he took pity upon the sacrifice and took them back to his realm to be his guests. There were those who believed that those he took would stay in the court of Queen Mab, fairy queen of winter, who must be the ruler of this winter lord, and thus his master. Those with hovels close to the altar, those like my family, had no such illusions. Sometimes you could hear them screaming and begging over the wind and hail. Sometimes you could only hear the metallic slap of the axe as he went about his butcher's work. When the storm ended, all that was left was fresh blood upon the altar. All else was taken, never to be seen again. "No way," Jake whispered, but he didn't sound so sure. "You doubt your mother's words?" Molly asked, feeling the old ways of speaking coming back to her. "There's no way this kind of thing could happen. Someone would hear about it and put a stop to it. Plus, why don't they leave? This winter guy probably wouldn't follow them, right?" She smirked at him. "The people knew what the sacrifice brought them, Jake. If they appeased the winter lord, then the winter only lasted 4 months, and was mellow in the months before spring. With spring would come such a bounty of crops, and on the years when the sacrifice was good, the crops were the best they had ever been. He only took one person. A fair trade for a year of peace and a bountiful harvest, they would say. I, too, said it. I said it for 16 years, until my own time came." Your time?" Jake asked, but he knew what his mother meant. "Until the mark appeared on my door, until the brand appeared on my hand." My mother cried, and my brother offered to hide me, but my father was staunch in his resolve. "The mark cannot be argued. You will go to the council hall and wait for his coming." I spent that week in the mayor's house, awaiting my fate. A dress of snow white was made for me, a garland of green steel forged for my head. Upon my feet were slippers of the softest doeskin, and I just knew they would pinch when I put them on. Many believed that if the sacrifice was female, and the winter lord found her beautiful, he might take her to his castle in the mountains, and make her his queen of winter, where she might live out her days as his consort and wife. The blood on the altar screamed of their stupidity, but the lies we tell ourselves are often the coziest. I did not need to be dragged to the stones when my time came. I walked up the street, mud squelching against my shoes, as the townspeople watched me with a mixture of sorrow and resolve. "We are sorry for your sacrifice, but it must be. Death for you, life for our crops," that look said. Had I not looked at the sacrifice just that way? Had I not known that the mark might appear on my own hand one day? I had been selfish in all those years. I had taken of the town's well, and now it was my time to give. I mounted the altar as the sun began to sink, but, despite my assuredness, I didn't feel selfish. Why should I give up my life? I asked myself. Because it was tradition? Because it was expected? Because it had always been? I began to see what I had never seen in the years of living in the town. Why did we give him what he wanted? Why did we let him take? Why didn't we just say no? As young as I was, I shouldn't have been so naive. When the sun began to set, the snow blew up out of nowhere, and the wind only pushed it in my face. I could hear the clomp of his horse as he came on, and as I squinted into the blowing wind, I could make out his antlered helm as he approached the altar. His axe made a sharp sound on the cobbles as he neared, and when he stopped before me, I could see him staring at me from under the visor of his helmet. He hadn't yet raised his axe, and from my vantage point, he seemed to be waiting for something. He was staring at me, his red eyes holding disbelief, and I saw my opportunity at that moment. I jumped from the altar, snow and ice battering me on all sides, and ran towards the woods. He screamed into the gathering night, and his voice sounded like the howl of an angry east wind. He came after me, hooves thundering steps behind me, but as I entered the woods I was ready for him. I'd played in these woods all my life, and I knew it would be impossible for a horse, even a horse as thin as his, to move quickly amongst the tightly packed trees. The forest flowed around me in a long brown blur, and I heard him roar as he realized he couldn't just ride me down. I heard his axe slap futilely into a tree as I ran, but I didn't stop to see what he was doing. I ran and ran until I found a burrow in the bottom of an ancient tree. I sank into it, ignoring the roots and spider webs that nestled there. I spent that night shivering amongst the bitter cold. As I shivered, I heard something I had not expected to hear. I heard the screams of the town as he laid it to waste. Other people ran into the woods, but took no notice of my hiding place. They ran like frightened rabbits, certain he would be behind them, but I knew better. They would die of cold, likely I would too. But as I pulled at the crunchy leaves that the hollow had swallowed up, I felt surer and surer that I would survive. I bided there till morning, the screaming dying out in the wee hours, and when I awoke, I was homeless and an orphan. I returned to the town long enough to get my things and leave. The houses were destroyed, hollow husks that would sit silent forever. The few people who still abided there looked at me with sullen eyes full of hate. They wanted to hurt me, wanted to kill me, but these sheep had stood by as their friends and family were taken by that winter night. I knew they would not raise their hands against me, and when I left for good. "What did you do then, Mama?" asked Hannah, her lip trembling as my story finally ended. "I met your father 6 months later. He was backpacking through Europe and took me as another backpacker. I'd been homeless for the last 6 months, scrounging food and looking over my shoulder for him. When he offered to let me come with him, I accepted. By the time we reached London, we were in love. And when he brought me to America to meet your grandparents, we were already planning to be married. That's how I came to be in America. That's how I came to escape the place of my birth." She let them sleep then, kissing their foreheads and turning off the light. Molly could hear them rolling in their beds, their dreams filled with ice. A fitful sleep was better than nothing, though. Molly sighed as she came into the living room. She hadn't told them everything, of course. How could you tell children everything? Sometimes the truth only brings fear. Molly took off the bandage and looked at the burn on the back of her hand. The circle with 3 slashes through it was as plain as it had been on the night she was to be sacrificed. Its meaning was as clear now as it had been then, too. He was coming for his lost sacrifice. She went to the window and looked out into the backyard. Molly could see him there, mounted on his ice horse, staring at her balefully with his piercing red orbs. He stood between the children's swing set and the wooden play fort they'd gotten last Christmas, looking as out of place as an altar stone at an autumn festival. 10 years was a long reprieve, she reflected, and as Molly stood holding his gaze, she knew what must be done. Joseph wouldn't understand, and the kids would be devastated, but maybe her sacrifice would stop them from being involved. As Molly opened the sliding door on the back porch, she felt the winter blizzard kiss her face as it had on that night 10 years ago. He walked his horse towards her, and as the axe came down, Molly knew there would be no throne of winter for her. She spread her arms and welcomed him to his sacrifice. Molly welcomed winter as her people had for generations, with blood and resolve. You know, it always surprises me how much of the living room these kids manage to spread mess across. I'm honestly not sure how they got wrapping paper this close to the fireplace, but I suppose that once I'm done collecting it, the fireplace will take care of it for me, to a certain degree, I mean. We all have Christmas traditions, and we all have a general tradition of kids getting out of school early for Christmas. What they get up to while they're out on school break is a bit of a mystery sometimes to us adults, but to the kids, I'm sure it makes perfect sense. So let's hear about some of those Christmas shenanigans, shall we? When we hear the very down-to-earth and not altogether dark tale at all of the mice in the walls. Mary was 6 when she first noticed the noises in the house. It all began like most childish things do, with fear. Laying in bed, she heard them in the walls and thought they were monsters. She would shrink underneath the covers and shudder at the scratching sounds that came from the wall and the ceiling of the old country house they lived in. Many nights, she would feel like she must surely shudder to death under her comforter. Mary would finally fall asleep with the sounds of scratching in her ears, and even then, she wasn't safe. She would have the worst dreams imaginable, dreams of monsters in the walls, with long claws and scabrous hands that drug their nails behind the walls. They were only looking for weak spots so they could come through and get her. Every morning when she woke up, Mary would say a little prayer and thank God for keeping her safe for another night. She would suffer like this for a whole month before finally meeting her monsters face to face and sleeping better the next night for it. Her dad had heard them too, it seemed. Mary found him in the laundry room one morning as she went to get a shirt for school, putting a glob of peanut butter inside a round plate. She sat and watched him for a moment, trying to figure out what he was doing, and when he looked back and found her lurking, he jumped a little in surprise. "Mornin', Squirt. You scared me half to death." "Mornin', Daddy. What are you doing?" He ruffled her hair and walked her out of the laundry room. "I'll show you when you get home from school. They should have noticed it by then." Mary went off to school, full of curiosity and wonder, and when she came home that afternoon, she went straight to the laundry room to check. The box was still there, and Mary heard something thrashing around inside. She was scared as she approached it, certain that the monsters from her nightmares would be inside and waiting for her to get close. As she peeked through one of the round holes in the box, Mary saw that it was nothing but a pair of fat brown rats. They became even more frantic when they saw her peeking. They started running and squealing around the little box, and as Mary watched them, she realized that they were just as scared as she had been. Mary didn't think about what she was doing when she opened the side of the box and let them scamper out. They didn't leave right away. They seemed to be trying to figure out whether Mary was tricking them or not. Eventually, their survival tendencies took over, and they left the box and ran behind the washing machine. Mary closed the box so that no other rats would scamper in, and went to the living room to watch cartoons. She was 2 hours into her afternoon cartoons when Dad came home and went straight to the trap. She heard him in there, grumbling confusedly as he looked at the sprung trap with no mice inside. In the end, her dad figured he'd been outsmarted and reset the box with more bait. Freeing his prisoners became an afternoon habit of Mary's. She would come home, make a snack, go see if any mice or rats were in the trap. They usually were. Some of them even looked like the same mice she'd seen from the day before. Every day she would turn them loose and watch them scamper off before closing the box and going to watch cartoons. She had stopped being afraid of the scampering she heard in the night, after learning that it was just the mice that she had been freeing. They were running and playing as though to thank her for helping them, and Mary went to sleep dreaming of happy mice playing hide-and-seek in the walls of the house. The week before Christmas, though, Daddy caught the magic mouse. That was also the day he caught her. She was out of school until after New Year's, and had gone from half a day of cartoons to a full day of cartoons. Both her brothers were out of the house, and Dad was out back chopping wood, when Mary heard a loud clang from the laundry room, and an ear-splitting squeal that cut through the sound of Huckleberry Hound like a knife through flesh. She jumped up from the couch and ran to the laundry room, wanting to see the big rat that Daddy had trapped. In that, she was not disappointed. The rat was huge, big as a kitten, and covered in long white fur that made its red eyes look fierce as they bulged from its head. Mary was hesitant to let this one go, given its size and fierce demeanor. It looked like it might be mean, but as she watched him through the holes in the trap, he did the last thing that Mary would have ever expected him to do. He talked. "Excuse me, child. Do you think you could let me out?" Mary started. Rats weren't supposed to talk. not to people at least. She couldn't do anything but stare at him as he stood on his back paws and used his front ones to rub at his nose and whiskers. When he didn't immediately speak again, Mary assumed that she had imagined it, letting her imagination run wild again. She started to stand up, ready to go back to her cartoons, when the rat spoke again. "Please, child, I'll do anything if you'll let me go." He had talked. Mary went down and peered at him again. He was still sitting there, front paws cleaning his face in a furtive little scamper. But his eyes were locked on Mary's. She knew that she hadn't imagined it this time. Her hands inched towards the lock, but stopped as they came in contact with the mechanism that would open the side. Mary looked at the rat distrustfully, and it stared back at her as she asked her burning question. You won't bite me, will you?" It laughed, and its laughter was high and strange. "No, no, my dear, I wouldn't dream of it. If you release me, I'll owe you a favor." That was all the reassurance Mary needed. She opened the side of the trap, and the rat scuttled off on its clicky little paws. He stopped to look at her as he twitched his nose, seeming to smile as the two stared at each other. He was a very old rat, and his fur was long and white, like an old man's beard. He was missing a finger on his left paw, and his tail looked as though someone had chewed the end of it off. He rubbed his paws over his snout again in that strange way of his, and Mary thought he would surely speak again. In her wonder, she hadn't heard her father coming inside. "So you're the one who's been screwing up my trap," he said, and when she turned to look at him, Mary could tell that she had made a mistake. He loomed in the doorway, snow sliding off his thick jacket to puddle on the floor, and as the mouse ran for the hills, her father clamped a hand around Mary's arm and dragged her into the living room. When he was done, Mary didn't think she'd be able to sit down for a week, and when he told her mother, she found herself grounded from TV for the rest of winter break. Mary sulked as she sat in bed that night, her backside hurting almost as much as her ego. Her brothers had been no help when they'd come home. They'd only said that she shouldn't have been so stupid as to let Dad's rats out of the cage. "They're not supposed to be inside, you dummy. Dad's trying to get rid of them." This information hadn't helped, since Mary didn't want Dad to get rid of them. As they scampered through her ceiling that night, she thought about that sound disappearing forever, and felt a fresh wave of tears. "Why are you crying, child?" Mary stifled a scream as she turned to see the old rat standing on her nightstand. His white fur stood out like a searchlight in the dark room, and Mary couldn't believe she hadn't seen him before. He was up on his hind legs, staring at her over his front paws, and he looked like a servant waiting for instructions. Dad's trying to get rid of you and your friends, and I don't want you to leave." "Nor do we, child. It's cold outside. Without shelter, my kind will die. I wish they'd leave you guys alone. I wish they'd just go away and not bother you guys anymore." They were childish words that Mary would come to regret. "My children and I owe you a great debt, young lady. Let me think of this and see if I might not be able to answer your wish." You could make my family disappear?" she asked, not daring to believe it. It would be just like the movies she'd seen with Mom and Dad a couple of nights ago, where the boy's family disappeared and he fought the burglars. This time, though, it would be for real, and not because they accidentally left without her. Mary could do whatever she wanted once they were gone, and no one would be around to stop her. It would be a Christmas dream come true, and Mary stared at the old rat with anticipation. The old rat seemed to contemplate before saying, "We shall see. Give me a few days to think it over, and I'll speak to you again." Mary fell asleep to the sound of his heavy paws leaving up the hallway. The next few days were full of excitement. Dad didn't catch anything in the trap. He'd put a lock on it to keep people out, and he seemed very upset about it. He'd started hearing them in the walls, making him very angry that he couldn't catch them. Mom seemed to be trying to take his mind off it, taking them out to see the lights, or to Christmas events in town, or just off spending time together as a family. All the while, Mary thought about her secret, and her secret friends in the walls. In her mind, she would never miss her family once they were gone. She would never want them back, and if she did, her new rat friend could bring them back and make it all better again. Children can sometimes fail to realize the harsh realities of loss. She awoke 2 days before Christmas to find the rat on her nightstand again. "Excellent news, child! We have found a way to make your family go away." She started awake when his squeaky little voice cut through the night. She had been nearly asleep and rolled over to look at him when she heard his squeaky voice. His red eyes were fixed on her with an odd intensity, and in his hand was a little bag made of plastic, wound shut with a bread tie. He held it out to her with some reverence, and when she took it, Mary saw that it was full of powder. "Your mother has laid out the start of breakfast in the morning. What you must do is sneak downstairs and put this magic powder in the box she uses to make the cakes. Then, when they eat the powder, they will go away, and you will have your wish." Mary looked at the little bag. It was no bigger than a Barbie purse, and the powder inside made a dry, crunchy sound when she pressed it. The magic rat must have made the spell powder, she guessed. So Mary adding it must be part of the spell. She got out of bed and tiptoed down the hall, the old rat scampering behind her. She took the stairs very slowly so they wouldn't creak, skipping the third step on the landing as she jumped softly over it. The downstairs was very dark, the living room furniture looking squashy and spooky in the dim light. Mary glanced around nervously as she tiptoed, expecting Dad to lunge out and grab her any minute. As her bare feet touched the linoleum, she knew she was home free. The box of pancake mix was just where the rat had said it would be. Her mother had left it out, along with biscuit mix, her mixing bowl, and a whisk. Mary opened the box of pancake mix and poured the magic powder like the rat had told her to. When the baggie was empty, she closed it back and turned to see the rat perched on the table as though he had been observing her. "Now, be certain that you don't eat anything at breakfast tomorrow. Otherwise, you'll disappear too," he warned. Mary made a mental note to sleep in tomorrow so she wouldn't be tempted by any of the yummy smells, and slipped back into bed with a smile on her face. Mary knew that tomorrow her Christmas wish would come true. The smells of pancakes and bacon awoke Mary early the next morning. Her stomach growled as she smelled them cooking, but she rolled up in her blankets and tried to ignore it. She could hear her brothers getting up, running downstairs, jockeying to be the first to taste the bacon. She heard the smack and the ow as her mother smacked someone on the hand with a spatula and told them to go set the table. Mary smelled eggs, too, as her mother cracked them into the pan, and now her dad was lumbering out of bed and moving towards the stairs. Her mother told him to help set the table, and he called her name up the stairs before going to help her brother. A few minutes later, her dad knocked on the door and told Mary breakfast was ready. When she didn't stir, he did it again, and when she still didn't move, he just walked downstairs to join the rest of the table. "Oh, well," she heard him grumble, "more for me." Mary hunkered under the covers. The moment she was waiting for had approached. They said grace, a low murmur as they all bowed their heads, and then the sounds of clinking forks and rattling plates began. Mary heard her brother talking about sledding today, Dad talking about finally finishing that surprise for someone in the barn, and Mom talking about some last-minute wrapping she needed to do. Her mother was just saying that she'd have to kick us all out of the house so she could finish, when she suddenly coughed in a wet, frightening way. Her dad asked if she was okay, but when she tried to say she was fine, one of her brothers started moaning, and Mary heard someone being sick all over the table. She was silent in her blanket cocoon, all the excitement lost. Was this what happened when people disappeared? Was this what disappearing people sounded like? She heard someone else being sick, and a chair crashing over as they fell. She thought it might be her dad, and when someone started screaming, she shuddered deeper into her blanket cocoon. There was the sound of breaking plates, someone falling to the floor and sobbing as someone was sick again and again. Her mother suggested that someone call an ambulance, but it was hard to make out as she vomited loudly. Mary heard Dad bellowing and thumping around, trying to get up from the table, before he fell hard to the floor and shook the whole house. Mary pulled her knees to her chest and waited for the sounds to be over, but they went on for much too long. The sounds of vomiting, crying, falling, breaking things, and the watery screams of her family took a long time to be replaced by silence. And in many ways, the silence was worse. The sounds didn't stop suddenly either. They tapered off, little by little, and when the last of the crying and dragging had stopped, Mary almost couldn't bring herself to move. Magic wasn't supposed to sound like that. In all the stories, magic just poofed people away. It didn't do whatever that was. She wanted to stay in her room forever, just crying and shaking. But as noon crept closer, her stomach began to growl, and Mary had to get up and use the toilet before her bladder burst. As she stood in the doorway to the bathroom, Mary felt her eyes straying to the head of the stairs. It was so quiet down there, much quieter than it had been earlier, and Mary wanted to know what was down there. She edged towards the stairs, feet feeling heavy, before peeking down the stairs. A sneaker-clad foot was just visible near the bottom. Mary wanted to go back to her room and crawl back under the covers, but she knew that she had to see what had happened. Mary knew that they hadn't disappeared like in a fairy story, and now she had to face whatever it was that had happened to them. The sneaker-clad foot belonged to one of her brothers, and after seeing him, she wished that she'd just gone back upstairs. Her brother was lying face down in a pool of blood in his own sick. He was reaching for something under the table, and as she looked, Mary realized that he was reaching for her mother's hand. Her hand stood out on the floor like a pale starfish, but unlike her brother, her back was against the floor, her face a terrible mask. Her mouth hung open, blood trickling from the corners, and her eyes were rimmed red with tears that stared into oblivion. When she'd fallen, she had taken most of the dishes on her side of the table with her, and her arms were covered in oozy cuts as she clutched the tablecloth in one stiff hand. Her other brother lay across the table, his blood staining the food with a dull, rusty red. Her dad had died on the way to the kitchen, his handprint against the linoleum, grisly. They were gone. They had gone away. Just as Mary had wanted. As she curled herself into a ball and sobbed against her knees, the perpetrator of these goings-on appeared beside her. "Now, why are you crying?" he asked, almost haughtily. "This is what you wanted, isn't it?" Mary looked at him, and he must have seen something on her face, because he scampered back a few steps, just out of arm's reach. "I just wanted them to go away. I didn't want you to kill them." "Kill them?" "Kill them like they killed my children for generations. You don't think this is the first appearance of the trap, do you? Your grandfather taught your father well, and he caught many of us in that trap. Then he would toss us, trap and all, into the river to drown. I've seen countless of my kind go into the river and never come back out again. They went away, and now so have your parents." He got close again, seeing she was in no mood to snatch him, and delivered the final blow. "And I didn't kill them, my girl. You did." He had misjudged her, though. Mary was indeed in a snatching mood. The rat's eyes bugged out of his skull as she squeezed him, red spittle running from the corners of his mouth as she squeezed him to death. He bit down on her hand, screaming as he died, but Mary didn't stop until she heard his bones break. She held his limp form as she shook it, and as she lay with her family on the bloody floor, her eyes ran thick with tears. That's where they found her when the police broke down the door, lying amidst the bodies of her family, her Christmas gift-giver, still clutched in her hand. I think I'm finally done scooping up all that paper. However, I still see some empty cardboard boxes that are going to need to be broken down so they fit into the kettle stove. So while I go about that, let me tell you about another great story. Though This one certainly isn't going to be any merrier. We all have, I'm sure, some sort of conviction when it comes to holiday tradition, and if yours is more of a religious leaning, then I understand that holiday confessional may be a part of your holiday schedule today. However, let's hope that the confessions your priest hears today are a little less dark than today's holiday confessional. The door banged closed and roused Father Maxey from his doze. He'd been napping in the confessional booth and had honestly expected not to be disturbed until morning. "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned." He glanced at his watch and saw it was midnight on Christmas Day. He tried to hide the sigh that escaped him and managed to hide it nicely behind a yawn. Whoever's idea this had been to hold a Christmas Eve confessional was beyond him, but so far it had netted very few sinners past 10 o'clock. Father Maxey had so far spoken to 2 drunks, parishioner Matthew, who believed that folding his sister's underwear was a sin, and a pervert who wanted to breathe heavily until he left a sinful mess in the box. Maxey had hoped the pervert would be the last, but this man had come in and ruined his celebration. "Father, are you there?" "Yes, my son," he said in a strained voice. "Speak your sin and I'll listen. This night I did break into a house without consent." Father Maxey nodded. He was often privy to crimes, both the black and the less serious. He'd heard more than one good Catholic who'd admitted to coveting his neighbor's flat screen this week. He usually kept such sins to himself, but last year, when that crying man had admitted to defiling all those children, he'd been forced to go to Detective O'Shaughnessy, another good Catholic. Sins were one thing, but Father Maxey was not the sort of priest to let child molestation continue, as the diocese could attest. This fellow, though, would likely be sent on with a few Hail Marys and a Merry Christmas. "Very well, my son. 12 Hail—" "I'm not finished, Father. I can't go to the police with this story, and I know that you've always been a good boy who will know what to do with this information." Good boy. That phrase took him back a little. Father Maxey, a priest well into his 40s, hadn't been a boy in many years. "Continue, my son. I will listen." "Well, I came in, I went to the tree, and began my work. I was half done, and there were so many presents, you understand, when I heard a noise upstairs. I ignored it at first. With 3 children in the home, someone was likely to be a light sleeper, but as I worked, the noise became louder. I finally recognized it for what it was, and the sound made me curious and a little worried. It was a child who was crying." Father Maxey leaned closer to the rectangle grate at the confession booth. Despite the hour, the stranger's story had drawn him in. Through the shadowy hole of the confession booth, Father Maxey could see an old man with a white beard and a bald head. He had a cap in his hand, and a garish red coat that looked damp with snow. Though his eyes were downcast, Father Maxey could tell that he was crying. There was a smell in the booth again, something detectable only as an afterthought. Peppermint, maybe, with an underlying smell of horse stall or barn floor. I went upstairs to have a look. Sometimes I do happen upon scenes of a less than cheery nature, and I thought I might do some good for a needy child. When I reached the landing, I immediately knew that something was wrong. A dog was slumped at the top of the stairs. I thought he was sleeping at first, but when I touched him, his head flopped to the side to show me that his neck was broken. Rascal was never a very good watchdog. I'd given him treats more than once to quiet him while I was there, and his friendliness had finally gotten the better of him. Then I heard the noises again, and turned my attention to the children's room. Maxey was silent on the other end of the grate, held fast by the stranger's story. He told his tale as though it was an episode of Law and Order, and as he spoke, Maxey almost felt as though he were there with him. He could see Rascal, a mutt with some German shepherd roots, lying on the floor with his neck snapped, and his friendly face still set in that eternal grin of slackening realization. The landing was dark, a nightlight spilling out the only light to be seen as the Christmas tree stood cheery sentinel below. He heard the whimper from the darkness, and turned his eyes toward the cracked door halfway down the hall. How was the stranger doing this? I crept, not wanting to spook anyone if the child was just having a nightmare. But when I reached the door, I heard the sound again and knew it was no sleeping child. The sound I heard was waking terror, the fear too dark to vocalize, and now its owner must suffer in crippled silence as the monster falls upon him. I pushed the door open, not caring who heard, and found myself inside an abattoir. The room, you see, was small, but big enough for 3 boys. 3 beds, each a different color, and each with the boy's name stenciled on the front, stood in a line. The other half of the room was free for play. The floor was clustered with toys and games. 2 of the beds were occupied, but not with happy, smiling boys like I'd seen before. Some nights when I visit, I would peek in on them and see what dreams their faces painted. Each of them had always been a fresh canvas, a fine boy with Christmas morning prancing in his dreams. But tonight, it was very different. He fetched a deep sigh, and Maxie was afraid he might stop. He was invested now. He needed to know how it ended, no matter how terrible. Tonight, I saw that 2 would never dream again. Their blood was a garish red as it soaked into the sheets. Maxie gasped, unsure what sort of confession this was becoming, but knowing it was like to be terrible. These 2, however, were luckier than the 3rd. They'd been cut before they woke, and thus had expired without knowing the terror the 3rd now lived in. They were too old, you see. The monster I had interrupted only preyed upon the youngest of lambs. When I opened the door, I had inadvertently stumbled upon the blackest of tableaus. One was a child in flannel pajamas, smiling superheroes looking on in frozen acceptance from his top, as blood oozed from one arm, which he had raised to defend himself. The other, the object of his fear, was a haggard man dressed as Kris Kringle. His coat and face were red with blood. His beard was matted with it as though he'd been chewing someone up just seconds before, and over his head was held a long knife, poised for the kill. He paused a moment as though to draw strength, and Father Maxie pulled in a frantic breath, his rapture too deep for breath. Another pause. "Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned. On this night I didn't knowingly commit murder. I knowingly crushed that man's skull against the frightened child's headboard, and I cannot say that my act was only to save that child. I felt wronged, blasphemed against. That he would take my image to inspire such fear was, to me, monstrous. There, I've also committed idolatry, I suppose. I compared myself to God, of whom I am a so-called saint of. I suppose my crimes and my sin are threefold, then. But I would do it again, to remove such a monster from this world, before he could hurt another child." His words moved the priest, but also convinced him. Was this man crazy? Had he really been a home invader turned savior, or was he... "What is your name, my son? What name did your mother give you on the day of your birth?" "Nicholas, Father. I am called Nicholas." Father Maxie felt it hard to speak. His throat was tight with tears, and his mind was a stranger to him. "Given the circumstances, my son, 12 Hail Marys should do it. You may say them on your way, for you have a long night ahead of you, if I'm not entirely mistaken." "I do, Father," the man almost cried. When he faced the mesh rectangle, Father McGhee could swear that he felt a warmth radiating through it. For just a moment, he felt filled with a spirit he hadn't felt since he was a child. It was as though all those years and all those miles had been erased, and he had received a portion of his faith back this Christmas Day. His night was far from over, though. He heard the man leave the booth and felt moved to catch a glimpse of the old saint. Much like the child he had been once, a child who had sat atop the stairs with his brother Aaron and waited all night to catch a glimpse. He wanted to see the man, to prove to himself that the Christmas spirit was flesh and magic. He threw the curtain aside, his face awash with rosy glow, but there was no jolly saint before him, no reindeer sleigh, no bag of toys or cheery elves, only a shivering, tear-streaked boy draped in a red coat. He had a large cut on his arm, just as the man had said he would, but was otherwise unharmed, for someone who would turn out to be the last victim of a serial killer called the Yuletide Carver. He'd killed 6 families that year, all of them killed in their beds, with the youngest child saved till last, before being brutally murdered. When the police arrived at the young boy's house later that morning, they found his dog, his parents, and his 2 brothers all dead in their beds. Their throats were slashed, and the weapon they found would match their wounds and the wounds of the other victims perfectly. The last body, the one dressed in a Santa costume that he'd likely stolen from the mall he'd been recently fired from, was found laid across the last bed, his skull caved in, the murder weapon clutched in his frozen hand. That would come later, though. For now, the priest bent down before the boy, like a penitent before the cross, and inspected his injuries. He wasn't hurt too badly. He had a long, jagged cut on his arm, but his eyes told the old priest that many of his injuries were below the surface. McGhee raised the child's face, a handsome and well-made face that would likely find little trouble finding a new home if none of his family could be found, and asked him about the man who'd saved him. It would be the statement in all the papers the next day. It would be the headline used by many to paint an end to the long night that had held the city for so long. It was Santa. The real Santa saved me.
All right. Now that all the cleaning's done, I guess it's time to sit down with a mug of hot cocoa and enjoy a little rest before dinner's on the table. Don't worry, I certainly put in my fair share before I sat down to tell stories with all of you. That being said, let's keep this Christmas trauma train going with a story that I really love, despite the fact that it's a little bleak. I have some strange hobbies myself, though this is always one that I hope to pick up later in life. There's nothing like watching someone make something out of something mundane, watching them take a piece of wood and make a horse or a slingshot or maybe an angel or something beautiful. So it is with a great amount of pleasure that I tell you about the protagonist's grandfather and his little bit of Christmas whittling.
I'll always remember that Christmas when the storm blew in. This was back in 82 or 83, and my family was living in a little house in North Georgia. Dad worked as a logger, Mom stayed at home to take care of me and my brother, and Grandpa had lived with us ever since Grandma died the year before. My uncle and aunt had come to stay with us for the holidays, and my 2 cousins, Ella and Jasper, were sharing the loft in the attic with me and my brother. Our little 3-bedroom cabin seemed pretty cramped, but we all just thought it would be until after the holidays. That was until the blizzard rolled in. It was December 20th, 4 days before Christmas, and we were all playing outside. The adults had said we were getting a little too loud and had asked us to go out for a bit, so we put on our coats and mittens and went out to play. My brother wanted to play hide and seek, and my cousins and I, all of us about 4 to 6 years older than him, had agreed begrudgingly, We were too old for baby games, my youngest cousin a whole year older than me, but we agreed, mostly so we'd have something to do. So Jasper and I were hiding under the porch, talking about something to do with hunting, I think, when I blinked as something drifted past my face. Jasper quieted as he noticed it, and I reached out my hand and caught a delicate-looking snowflake. I'd seen snow before. You don't live in North Georgia for long without seeing some snow, but this was the first snow I thought might actually stick. It had been unseasonably warm for North Georgia, most days sitting around 45, and we had been worried that our white Christmas might be a bust. As the snow began to fall harder, really coming down, we abandoned our game of hide-and-seek and devolved into little kids at the sight of all that powder. It was really amazing how quickly it came down, half a foot seeming to appear in minutes, and we began making snowmen, having snowball fights, and looking for the sleds in the tool shed so we could go to the holler and glide down on the fresh powder. Our parents came out on the porch, looking in awe at all that snow, and when Dad tapped his little thermometer that hung next to the rain gauge, I realized that it was pushing 50 degrees. I didn't think about it at the time, but there was no way that all that snow could be sticking. It was above freezing, and the snow should have been turning into slush before it hit the ground. To us, it seemed like a Christmas miracle, but as the sun went down and the adults went inside, I noticed Grandpa come out, and he looked at the sky with distrust. I watched as he walked out to the wood pile and took a piece of stove wood back with him, my distraction earning me a snowball upside my head from Ella. Looking back on it, Grandpa had known what was coming, and even then he started getting ready for it. We went to bed that night with visions of snowball fights and sledding dancing in our heads, but we woke up to a blizzard outside. My dad and uncle went to stare at it on the porch, drinking coffee as they discussed what to do. Dad had laid by food, but he was worried that he didn't have enough for the 9 people long term. My uncle joked that we could always eat Grandpa, but Dad said that it'd be like chewing on a boiled owl, and they both just laughed. Grandpa, on the other hand, was whittling something from the stove wood. He had been working on it through the night, and it kind of looked like a crossroads sign. It was thick enough in the middle, however, which made me think that there might be more to it. I was too excited for another day of snow, however, to pay Grandpa much heed. Not when there were winter festivities to get up to. My cousins and I played in the blizzard that day, but our games were muted some as the wind picked up and the snow began to fly. The wind was blowing too hard for our snowballs to fly straight. We tried sledding, but the snow was coming down too hard for us to see, and the ice that was forming was starting to hurt our ears and faces. By lunchtime, we were forced to come in out of the cold. Our coats and mittens and hats were soaked through, and after hanging them on pegs in the mud room, we went into the attic loft, where we were all sleeping to warm up. We had all been set up in sleeping bags up there, my aunt and uncle taking the room I shared with my brother, and it was like having a little camp out. The heat from the fire in the living room made it very warm up there, and as Jasper and I watched from the upper window, he leaned close to the glass and pointed into the woods. "You see that?" he asked. I squinted into the sea of white, trying to find it, and finally picking out a single silhouette. It looked like an animal, something on all fours, but it was gone as the wind blew up again, and we were both left looking at the snowy forest. He asked if I'd seen it, probably trying to figure out if he'd been seeing things, and I assured him that I had seen it too. We both sat by the window after the adults had gone to bed, looking out and hoping to catch a glimpse of something in the blowing snow. We didn't see anything, at least I didn't, but we both assured the other that we could see all sorts of spooky things out there. The next day, the blizzard was even worse. December 22nd was too stormy for any of us to even think about going out to play, and when my uncle and father came out bundled to the eyes in several winter coats and the old deerskin breeches they sometimes wore for winter work, I knew they intended to go out anyway. Mom told them they were crazy, but Dad said they needed supplies. The town was only about 2 miles north through the woods, and they could get the essentials and head back before lunch. He kissed Mom and told me to hold down the fort while he was gone. I should be back soon. It's only a couple of miles. They set out about 7, just after breakfast, and I didn't envy them. With the blizzard raging, we mostly sat around the house and watched TV. The set only got 10 channels on a good day, and today we were lucky to get 2. The local weather station came through, on and off, and as the little kids watched public access, I sat and read on the saggy old couch. My cousin had decided to read a magazine he'd brought, and the only breakup over the muffled sound of the TV was Grandpa as he carved his little figure. The skiff, skiff, skiff of Grandpa's whittling knife kept leading me away from the adventures of Frodo and Sam, and I found myself looking at him as he worked. If he was self-conscious about it, he never showed it. Grandpa wasn't so old that he seemed ancient, but even as a kid, he seemed like some wise old elf to a sprat like me. After a while, I finally asked him what he was making, and his answer made me put my book down entirely. A totem? Like a tribal thing? Like in Robinson Crusoe? He smiled wetly at me. Kind of. This one is to keep something specific away, though. Something we may get a look at if we're unlucky. What's that? My cousin asked, and I realized he'd been listening too. The magazine lay across his lap now, and as Grandpa set his knife aside, he lay it on the arm of the chair and moved over to sit closer. Grandpa had just opened his mouth to speak when the lights suddenly went out, and the living room was left in semi-darkness. The power had struggled on manfully, but it had finally given up the ghost. The fire in the grate cast Grandpa in a ghostly pall, and I imagined that this was how his own grandfather had looked when he told stories, once upon a time. When I was younger than you two, but right about Mac's age there, he said, pointing to my brother, there was a blizzard much like this one. It blew in right about Christmas, and it stayed for 5 or 6 days. My brother and I thought it was great, and we played in the snow as the adults looked on with concern. Did we have enough firewood? Did we have enough food? None of that mattered to us, though. Those were matters for adults, and we threw snowballs and built forts and played until the sun set each day. The fire crackled as the little kids moved closer to Grandpa, and we settled in for a story. As the blizzard went on, we noticed that something was stalking the woods around the cabin. It came on all fours like a deer or a stag, but sometimes, if you were quick, you could see it on 2 legs as well. It never got close, not in the beginning, but as the blizzard went on, it crept closer and closer to the house. At night, my brother and I would sit in the attic window, and sometimes its eyes were red as coals in the dark. We were all gathered around him then, listening to the tale, enveloped in the mystery of the creature. Me and Jasper especially, since I was pretty sure that we had seen it yesterday. Every day it got a little closer, and every day the storm got a little worse. My own grandpa, a man who had seen the beginning of a new century, sat in a chair by the fire and whittled from the first day of the storm to the last. His old knife, this knife, actually, he said as he held up a fixed-blade knife with a silver handle, was very sharp, and the wood had fallen in thick curls as he worked. I was enthralled by the little carving he was making. I asked him what it was as more of it came out, and he told me it was a ward against something that might come with the storm. I watched him, studied him, and at night we watched the red eyes of the dear thing get closer and closer to the house. By the second night, the eyes might as well be right on the porch, and we were shuddering in our blankets as we wondered what it was. The storm outside made a perfect backdrop for the story, and we were so captured by the tale that we didn't even hear my mother stepping in from the kitchen. On the last day,
As the blizzard raged, we heard hoofbeats on the porch. My father wanted to go out and see what it was, but Grandpa said he'd fix it. He told us to go into the attic, told my father and mother to go to their room, and took the thing he had carved out to the porch. There, as we tried to see through the window, we saw a bright light, and the deer fell back into the snow. The deer, however, was wrong. Its legs were too long, its arms ended in strange fingers, and its eyes were— "Pop!" Mom yelled, making all of us jump. "I know you're not trying to keep those kids up all night with such tales." Grandpa had jumped a little too, so enthralled by his own story. He looked sheepish, like he'd been caught doing something wrong, and shrugged as he gave another gummy smile. We all looked at her incredulously, as if not sure what to make of her, but if it made her self-conscious, she didn't budge. "Just a little Christmas story, Peg. I didn't mean any harm." My mother gave him a hard look. "Well, if these boys are awake all night, shivering at the ghosts of some story, then you can sit up with them." She returned to the kitchen then, the smells of lunch wafting from the wood stove that she had in there. "What was it?" I asked Grandpa, keeping my voice low so my mom wouldn't hear, but he shook his head as he returned to his whittling. "Better not to say, boy. Don't want your mother to tell your dad, and then I'll get thrown out in the snow like the leftovers," he said with a wink. He tried to play it off as a joke, but I knew that Grandpa was always very aware that he was a guest in my parents' house. He lived with us for most of my young life, seeing me graduate high school before dying in his sleep one spring, but Mom told me once that it was a blessing to him to be so close to her and Dad and his grandkids. Her other siblings had moved away when they grew up, and Grandpa couldn't imagine himself living anywhere but in the woods that he loved so much. As night fell and my dad and uncle still hadn't returned, Mom started getting worried. The town wasn't that far away, and they should have been back by now. She figured they had just gotten turned around, and maybe they'd come stumbling in after dark. But as the dinner dishes were cleaned away and we all prepared for bed, my mom and aunt became less sure. As we watched through the window, seeing the red eyes that Grandpa had told us about, I heard them making plans to go look for him the next day. "What do you reckon it is?" Jasper said, the two of us watching the eyes as they moved fitfully through the trees that surrounded our cabin. "Dunno. I've never seen anything like that," I admitted. As my mom and aunt turned in, and the light that filtered through the boards went out, we settled in as well, still not sure what tomorrow would bring. December 23rd dawned cold, with still no sign of my dad or uncle. Mom was frantic, flitting about the kitchen like a hummingbird, and when she called us to the kitchen around noon, we all expected what was coming. She was dressed warmly, her two thickest coats thrown over a pair of snow pants, and the boots that she had on were Dad's with several pairs of socks inside. "I'm going into town to see about your father. Until I get back, your aunt's in charge. You boys listen to her, okay? Keep an eye on your grandpa. He may need help, and if I'm not here to help with him, then that falls to you two. Be good, and be safe. If the phones come back on, call the sheriff and tell him that your father never came home. If I haven't made it to town, then someone will need to go out and look for us." She left around 11, lunch already on the table, and I watched her go from the front door as she disappeared into the snow. I hoped I would see her again, but after watching my dad and uncle disappear out there too, I wasn't sure I would. As I watched, I could also see the shadow of the creature as it stalked our little house. It was still on all fours, its antlers sometimes knocking snow from the trees, but sometimes, when the wind would blow up, I could see it rise onto its back legs for the briefest moment before it was lost from sight. Mom didn't come back for dinner, and as we went to bed, I could hear my aunt crying in the room that she had shared with my uncle. We all woke up on the 24th, Christmas Eve, feeling hopeless and unsure of what to do. With every passing day, this felt less like a fun time and more like a real problem. My cousins and I started to feel like a bunch of westbound settlers who were watching the hills for Indians. My aunt didn't get up to make us breakfast, and Ella said that she had fallen asleep in my brother's bed with an empty bottle by her head. It was probably the corn whiskey that Dad kept for emergencies, and I suppose that this counted as one of those. We ate cold food from the fridge, Jasper making some eggs to go with it, and the two of us sat and watched the shadowy creature from the porch as we ate. My brother and Ella had gone back to the attic, feeling like they might go back to sleep, which is why they weren't there for what happened next. As we sat munching on cold ham and burnt eggs, the creature stalked the house from the depths of the rising storm. The blizzard was focused, a swirling vortex that seemed to enclose us in a swirl of winter. We were powerless to do anything about it, so we just sat there and watched as it raged and frothed. The creature was barely visible, an outline more often than not, and it seemed odd now that we weren't more worried about it. Both of us had hunted deer, however, and the thought of being scared by a half-starved buck seemed silly. When it turned its horned head towards us, its eyes boring into our conversation as it stepped slowly towards the house, the idea no longer seemed so silly. "What the hell is that?" my cousin said, rising so quickly that his stool went spilling over. "What is that thing?" It had come out of the storm, and we could see that it was a solid white buck, its skin hanging on it like a carcass. Carcass was an apt word, too. The deer looked like a corpse, like some half-eaten piece of roadkill that had gotten up to seek revenge. Its antlers were huge, the tines many and majestic. It was a 13 or 14-point buck by a quick count, but as I watched, the sharp bones seemed to move with an eerie independence from their host. They squirmed like a nest of snakes, and the creature reminded me of Medusa as it stood glowering at us. Its blazing eyes still glowed like coals, and it was baring its flat teeth at us like it meant to bite. I wished, suddenly, that I had my rifle, but it was in the room with my aunt, and absolutely of no use to me here. I don't think either of us were truly afraid until the creature stood up on its hind legs, legs that now seemed as boneless as the Gumby character that my little brother liked to watch, and it began to run at us. We barely made it into the house, slamming the door behind us when it hit the wood hard enough to shake it in the frame. Jasper and I went deeper into the house, but as I came to the ladder that led to the attic, I remembered Grandpa was still in the living room. Mom's words echoed in my head, and I told him to go on and make sure the others were okay. He nodded, understanding, and when I got to the living room, I found Grandpa still working on his totem. "Grandpa, we've got to go," I told him, trying to get him up. This thing, it's going to get us if we don't." "I'm almost done, kiddo. Once I'm done, we'll be safe." I heard the door beginning to splinter, but Grandpa just shrugged me off as I tried to help him up. "Grandpa, we need to get to the attic. I've seen this thing, and I can tell you that your carving isn't going to—" But I never finished. The door burst open then, and the cadaverous deer creature came snorting into the living room. I was frozen in fear as it strode in, its hooves clicking on the floor, and I saw its front legs end in the same snaky appendages that had decorated its head. They were like fingers in some nightmare picture, and its red eyes focused on us as it came striding into the living room. His horns made a hellish noise as they scraped the ceiling, sending curls of wood down in a shower. He was focused on Grandpa, his eyes boring into him, but as I started to bolt, he swept up a hand and held me back. I looked down and found that to my surprise the old man was smiling. "Fancy meeting you again after all this time," Grandpa said, the deer snarling and snorting a mere 15 feet away. He started moving after a few tense seconds, but when Grandpa lifted his hand, I was momentarily blinded by a white-hot light that emanated from the carving there. I saw the face carved there for half a bitter second, the huge eyes and roaring mouth looking formidable, and then I had to throw my hands over my eyes as my senses were assaulted by a sudden cry of primal rage. It was as if the totem was bellowing at the interloper, screaming down the deer thing that meant to kill me and Grandpa, and all my senses seemed assaulted at once. I was blind, deaf, smellless, unspeaking, and incapable of thought. I was as Adam must have been for the first few moments of his creation, and when I was able to gain my senses, I found myself lying on the floor as Grandpa looked on placidly. Of the deer, there was no sign, and Grandpa's totem looked as if it had been through the heart of a blazing inferno. The features were still perfect, only charred to a dumb muteness by the effort of expelling the deer thing. It had taken everything the little effigy had to set the creature aside, and now it was used up. Grandpa handed it to me, the carving leaving char stains on my fingers as it passed between us. "Here, you might need to know how to carve one yourself someday." I started to thank him, but that was when I heard my father's angry yell as he asked just what the hell had happened to the door. Some of his anger was set aside when I came running up to hug him, and I could see both my uncle and my mother standing slightly behind him as they looked concerned and confused. I tried my best to explain what had happened, but I don't think they believed me. Dad was skeptical that all this had happened in the few hours that he'd been gone, but Mom pointed out that he'd been gone for at least a day and a half. That really threw him, and when he told her that he had just left that morning, she said that he'd been in the woods since the 21st. "Yeah," he agreed, "this morning." The two went back and forth, but when I told Mom that she had been in the woods overnight as well, she also looked confused. Both of them had been in the woods overnight. Dad had actually been in the woods for 2 nights, but both parties said that the sun had never gone down. They had been roaming through the woods looking for the town and had just appeared back here all of a sudden. When Dad had found Mom in the woods, he assumed that she had come out looking for him. They had all 3 returned home, a trip that had taken less than a few minutes, and figured they had just gotten turned around in the blizzard. Speaking of the blizzard, it had stopped as suddenly as it had started. The power came back on a little while later, and when my aunt woke up to find her husband had returned, we all took stock of the fridge and began working on one of the best Christmas dinners ever. That particular Christmas was one that I'll always remember, and not just because of the deer thing. We had many more Christmases like that in the years to come, but none quite so tumultuous as that one. I still live in that house, both my parents long dead, but every year we all get together and have Christmas like we used to. We tell our kids and grandkids about the Christmas we were all snowed in, and I've been practicing my whittling since the day Grandpa set the deer thing aside in a blaze of light. I haven't seen one since, but who knows who might come to visit one snowy Christmas in Appalachia. Man, I can smell that food in the kitchen. I really wish you guys were here to have some. It smells wonderful. Like most years, I'm sitting at my in-laws' house because, well, they live closer. And it's always amazing the wonderful smells that come out of the kitchen around this time of year. So, let's get on with these tales, shall we? Not to be outdone, this next one is a real crowd pleaser. And it's likely one of the ones that brought some of you guys to my channel in the first place. So, when you're explaining to your children why they should behave during the Christmas season, don't forget to let them know what will happen if they run afoul of Frau Perchta.
I can still remember my mother's look when I told her I wanted to invite Lucy to spend the holidays with us. She furrowed her brow in that way that she often did when she thinks something is a bad idea. Are you sure you want to invite Lucy, dear? Of course I'm sure. Lucy's my best friend, Mom. She let the water run over her hands for a few seconds, washing the potatoes she'd been making for dinner. I know she's your best friend, dear, but Lucy can be a little much sometimes. How long will she be staying? This was an odd question for my mother. She was usually charitable, but I knew this was the time of the year that always made her nervous. It was the 29th of December, Christmas is now in the rearview mirror, and New Year's looming on the horizon. None of this mattered, though, because my family was 4 days into celebrating the 12 nights of Christmas. My family's Christian, but the sect we belong to believes in the significance of the 12th night. The 12th night was marked by the Feast of Epiphany, and we spent most of the day at service, singing songs and praising God. On the 12th night, we always held a large meal, and Mother always made the turtle to celebrate the occasion. That's also the night that Frau Perchta visits us, and that could be a tumultuous time all of its own. Not a lot of people celebrate the 12th night. Christmas is usually the highlight of the season, but it's a religious tradition that my mother and father brought from France when we moved here. It's been a part of my life for so long that it just seems normal to me. To my knowledge, Lucy's family was not religious at all, so Lucy was looking forward to seeing what other holidays were like. Her family will be back on the 10th, just in time for the end of Christmas, I said, almost pleading for her not to reconsider. My mother looked at her potatoes as she worked. She knows that it's not all fun and games, right? We go to church a lot those days, and the celebration is mostly religious. Yes, I assured her, she knows it's not all fun and games. That wasn't a complete lie. Lucy had been interested in my family's quaint holiday customs, and I had tried to impress upon her that this time of year was very important to my family. There had been a lot of questions in my class about the 12 nights of Christmas. I told them how it had more to do with the nativity play and less to do with the song. I told them how we had the turtle, a pastry with a pea in it, and how if you found the pea, you got to be the queen for the evening. I usually found it, and my parents made a game of me being the queen for the night and parading me around the house. Lastly, I told them about Frau Perchta, the old woman who would visit on the 12th night and give out presents to good children. I believed this was the reason that Lucy wanted to stay with me instead of Chelsea or Maggie, her two other friends. Lucy saw an opportunity to get a second Christmas of sorts, and she wanted to use my holiday to get more presents. I wasn't too offended by this idea. I liked extra gifts too, but the idea of her using Frau Perchta to get them made me feel a little funny. Not really guilty, but not good either. Lucy was used to dealing with the kind of generous gift givers like Santa Claus. Frau Perchta was not a benevolent, jolly being. The Frau was honestly a little scary, and I had only just gotten comfortable around her myself. She was a gift-giving entity, which was nice, but she was also a stick that my parents would use to correct me when I was bad. Unlike Santa, the Frau was not just a Christmas entity either. The Frau was always watching, always judging, and they used her year-round lest I step out of line. Better behave, Frau Perchta will see. Put that candy back, you wouldn't want me to tell the Frau. Better go to sleep before Frau Perchta knows you're being naughty. I had never incurred the wrath of the Frau. My mum had said she would switch me if I were naughty. Mum also told stories of a sister that had gone missing after being especially willful one year. She had never seen her again, and her own mother had always claimed that it was the Frau's doing. Frau Perchta was a coin with two faces, and one of those faces had teeth. Mom nodded stiffly. Far be it from me to turn guests away during the holidays. Just make sure she's on her best behavior. You know how the Frau feels about willful children. I shuddered as she said the words, remembering the sister she never saw again. Lucy arrived 2 days later, and her parents thanked us for agreeing to let her stay. They were going to see friends out of town, places where Lucy would be relegated to a back room of strange children while their parents gathered. They offered my parents money for her food and board, but they waved it away. Lucy was our guest, and they were glad to have her. Her parents smiled at that, kissing their daughter goodbye as they were off to the airport to catch a flight. My parents had helped Lucy up to my room. Lucy had brought enough luggage for a month, and her luggage seemed to bulge with unnecessary clothes. I showed her the cot we had set up for her, and the spot in my closet I had emptied out for her clothes. She made appreciative noises right up until my parents left, and then she scoffed at the idea of sleeping on a saggy old cot. I saw her eyeballing my canopy bed before she made her intentions known. As a guest, it would only be generous for you to let me use your bed. But then where am I going to sleep? I asked, not quite understanding the trade-off. There was no way that we could share the bed. The mattress fell too short for me sometimes. I looked at the floor, but wrinkled my nose at the idea of sleeping there. I wasn't a messy child, but sleeping on the floor was still a great way to roll over on a Lego or a Barbie shoe. Well, why don't you sleep on the cot? It'll be like you're on holiday, she said, setting her bag on the foot of the bed and telling me about the Barbies she'd brought and the DVDs we could watch. I just sighed and took my princess blanket and pillow and sat up on the cot. This was going to be a long few weeks. My mother thought it was very sweet of me to let Lucy use the bed. I smiled and told her it was the right thing to do for a guest. The cot was lumpy, and I slept poorly on the sagging camp mattress. I thought mean things about Lucy every time I saw her snug in my bed, but I was careful to cut those kinds of thoughts off pretty quick. Such things might be willful, and I wasn't sure if Frau Perchta could read minds. I wasn't in a big hurry to find out, either. The first week went by pretty quickly. Lucy and I played with dolls, watched cartoons in our PJs, helped Mom around the house, and spent our nights giggling and telling secrets. Lucy was always polite and well-behaved around my parents, but she could be a bit of a brat in private. She complained that our house was too small and our food was too bland. It was too cold in here, and the service we dragged her to every night was too dull. I had seen my father shoot her dark looks as she sat in the pew beside me and sighed or fidgeted, but he was too kind to ever say much. She seemed to find our services quaint but boring, and was always ready to go when it was time to leave. On New Year's, Mom and Dad let us stay up with them so we could see the midnight ball drop and toast the New Year with sparkling cider. We sat in front of the TV, watching the New Year's special and waiting for midnight. Lucy told me about how last year she and her parents had been in Paris for the New Year, and her mother had let her drink some champagne when the clock struck midnight. I asked her what it had tasted like, and she said, too low for my parents to hear, it tasted better than this gross juice, and stuck her tongue out as she laughed. When she went to set her glass down, I saw it tip over and spill onto the carpet. She picked it up quickly, and my mother saw the stain before she saw the glass. "Oh, no! Who spilled grape juice on the carpet?" she asked. Lucy pointed the finger at me. "It was an accident, ma'am. She didn't mean to." I started to become indignant, but Lucy gave me a pitiful look that communicated clearly that she did not want to get in trouble. I didn't say anything, and Mom made me get a towel to help clean it up. When they yelled, "Happy New Year," I looked up quickly, having missed the ball drop. I didn't whisper to Lucy that night. I think she knew I wasn't happy with her. The second week was the worst. Lucy began to complain about the daily trips to church, and even my father's good mood was starting to stretch thin. We had neighbors who agreed to watch her while we went to church. I was honestly a little glad for the time away from Lucy. Her outbursts and snarky attitude were funny at school, usually making teachers grind their teeth and other students laugh. At home, she just came off as a brat and kind of mean. After that, she mostly laid around in her pajamas and did whatever she wanted. Her complaints about our food being too bland or being the same thing every day were starting to wear on my mother as well. I could see her counting the days until Lucy's parents would come to get her, and I had started looking forward to her leaving as well. Mom became a little weird where Lucy was concerned. I heard her calling her parents a few times, telling them how Lucy was missing them, and asked when they were coming back. Lucy had made no such claims. She was clearly enjoying being our guest, and her parents coming back was the farthest thing from her mind. Despite Mom's best efforts, it appeared that Lucy would be with us through the weekend. Mom didn't seem happy about this, and I wondered if she was worried what the Frau would make of Lucy. I wasn't happy with Lucy, but I didn't want her to disappear. The day of the 12th night arrived, and the house was filled with the low excitement that always came around this time of year. Mom and Dad were cleaning wildly, Mom taking breaks to cook the meal for tonight. Lucy and I were relegated to my bedroom so the house could stay clean. Lucy complained about this, of course, and kept asking me questions about the feast. What kind of food would we have? When would the princess cake be served, which is what she started calling the turtle? Would the Frau be here to give presents before or after the meal? Would we have to go to church to get the gifts? She went on and on and on until I finally told her I didn't know. I was tired of her being here, and I kind of wanted her to leave. Mom had the food ready before we left for service that night, and laid the turtle out under a bowl to cool. The sitter made her way over, giving Lucy a look that clearly said she regretted promising to watch her, and we left for church. The Christmas service was always beautiful. The choir sang hymns, and Mom made me a beautiful white dress for the service. The pastor read a sermon about the birth of Christ and his presentation to the temple. He talked about how on the day of the Epiphany, the 12th day, it was revealed that Jesus was the incarnation of God the Father, and how this was a momentous occasion for people so that they could have a personal relationship and not depend on the temple of priests. I listened intently, having heard the story before, but I always enjoyed the pastor's stories about the life of Christ. I was a little sad when it ended, knowing that I would have to go back to Lucy and her meanness. I closed my eyes before leaving and asked Jesus to help me. I asked him to take this burden away from me, which was something I had heard people say before. Maybe I should have been a little more careful with my prayers. Lucy was dressed in a similar white dress when we got home, a gift from my family to hers for the feast. The sitter left, waving and thanking my mother for the $10 she handed her, but going in a hurry without a backwards glance. Lucy complained about the dress almost at once, saying it didn't fit right and it was too baggy for her. She said the hem was too long and that she kept tripping over it. My mother mostly ignored her as I helped her get the food onto the table. Then we prayed over the meal and sat down to enjoy our feast. Mom had made the red wassail for the occasion. The warm apple cider tasted great after being out in the cold. There were mashed potatoes, ham, fruits and vegetables, both stewed and raw, pies, roast, and of course the turtle, which sat as the centerpiece. We all dug in, and it was the first time I had heard Lucy stop talking in days. She ate a little of everything, her eyes sliding again and again to the turtle, and who could blame her? The pastry glistened with sugar and looked delicious. When we'd all eaten as much as we could, Mom cut the turtle and served us all a piece. Remember, if you find the pea, you get to be royalty for the evening, she reminded us. We all dug in, savoring the tasty tart, and I expected to find the pea with every bite. I think, even then, I believed that my parents let me have the pea every year, so I could be princess of the feast. As I saw my tart becoming smaller and smaller, I began to wonder if they had moved it this year. Lucy was eating as well, but I saw her hand slip into her pocket as she ate, clenching something. Suddenly she sat up, bringing her hand out of her pocket and proclaiming that she had found the pea. I could only gape as my parents congratulated her. Had she just cheated to become the princess of the feast? I didn't have long to gape, however, since as she turned to me, grinning, there was a light tap on our door. Mom stiffened, looking at Lucy and me, saying, "Frau Perchta has arrived." She and Dad left the table, heading for the door, but I stopped Lucy as she started to get up. "You cheated! Why would you do that?" I was less mad than hurt, honestly. Lucy was our guest. We had treated her far better than she had treated us, and this was just needless. I would have let her share the title with me if I had won, but for her to cheat to win was just... My young mind didn't have a word to describe it then. I simply couldn't make sense of why she would do this. Duh! Your parents would have probably just given you the piece with the pea in it. While you were at church, I lifted the corner and saw it in the piece that your mom gave to you. So I took it and put it in my pocket for later. It wouldn't be fair for you to just win, so I cheated, just like your parents were going to. Now step aside, peasant. The princess is off to get her presents. And with that, she skipped off towards the living room. I had little choice but to follow after her. The Frau was seated in the living room when I arrived. Frau Perchta, as I've said, had always scared me a little. She was dressed in a habit, a long white shawl covering her face and framing her ghostly mask that she always wore. The mask was made of dark wood, looking ancient and resembling a smiling ogre. She was hunched, using a cane to get around, and she leaned forward in the chair as she beckoned me towards her with a gnarled hand. "Come forward, child." I took a step, her voice sounding like dry leaves in a hollow log. Lucy stepped forward instead, however, standing before the Frau and jutting her chin out. "Hey, I was here first. I get my gifts before her." My mother sucked in a breath, and my father's eyes got very wide as his skin seemed to pale. The mask bent to look at Lucy, and the wooden thing did not seem to like what it saw. "Run along, child. You are not of my ilk, and I would not judge you by my rules." Lucy huffed out an angry breath. "Hey, I was promised presents from you. What, I don't get presents just because I'm not part of this place?" The wearer of that mask sucked in a long, suffering breath and looked at Lucy icily. "Clearly, you are not part of this place, child. If you were, you would know it was wise to treat me with respect when I honor a household with my presence." "Oh, so I'm just supposed to accept that you didn't bring me anything." She brought the pea out of her pocket and waved it in front of the mask. "I am the princess of the feast, and I want my gift. I'm royalty today, and you can't tell a princess no," she said haughtily. Her bluster melted away when the old woman's hand whipped around her slender neck. "Even if you were the grandest princess in all the land, I answer to a higher power, and I will not be spoken to in such a way. You wish to have my gifts? Please prepare to receive them." She stood, stooped no longer, and carried Lucy's struggling body over to the coffee table. She shoved the magazines and knickknacks off of it and slammed the struggling girl onto the surface. I looked at my parents, but both of them were frozen in horror and surprise. I screamed for them to do something, and my voice seemed to galvanize them. My father looked at Mother, nudging her and whispering something to her that seemed to bring her out of her trance. She moved in front of me, blocking the scene from view and whispering soothing words to me as my friend gagged and screamed. Through the crook of my mother's arm, I could see the old woman take a knife from beneath her robes and lift it over the struggling girl. Her reddening face was terrifying, seeing the knife preparing to gut her as she struggled all the harder. The old woman's grip was like iron, though, and as she tried to line up her blade, she seemed to be having trouble through the mask. The tip hooked beneath the lip of that wooden mask and swung it up to sit on her head, and it was then that she seemed to notice me. She looked at my mother, her dry voice cracked out, bringing her back around to face her. "Do not shelter that girl. Let her see what befall those who will cross the white." Mom looked down at me, clearly not wanting me to see what was about to happen, but moved aside obediently. When I caught sight of the Frau's face, I put my hands to my mouth to stifle a scream. The ogre mask was an improvement compared to what lay beneath. Her gaunt face was skeletal, the nose little more than a flap of skin, and that skin was ice blue and stretched over her skull like wax paper. Her teeth were sharp, like little stones in her mouth, and she held my eyes with a pair of crystalline blue ones that nearly gave me frostbite. She released me a moment later, bending to the struggling girl she was holding against my mum's coffee table, and lifting the knife to get to work. Lucy struggled frantically. She was aware, it seemed, that this was no joke, and that neither my parents nor her parents were going to swoop in to save her. Lucy had found someone who would not give her a pass because she was young and pretty. She had found a creature to which these things did not matter. Lucy had learned too late that sometimes it's best not to keep poking the bear when it's given you a chance to run. When the knife came down, it seemed to surprise her all over again. Her white dress began to soak with blood, the blade cutting through her abdomen and slitting her belly open. The old woman cut into her guts, sticking the knife blade first into the table and dragging out handfuls of ropey entrails. She threw them on the ground, Lucy twitching and convulsing as her life bled away. Her face had gone from red to purple, and her eyes bugged out as the lack of air caught up with her. It seemed the blood loss won out, though, because I saw her bulging eyes roll up to the whites as her purple face slackened into a death mask. She went limp, head lolling to the side, and the Frau reached behind her to grab a scratchy bag from beside the chair. She upended the sack, spilling sticks and pine cones, old wrappers and vegetable peels, into the opening before taking out a long bone needle and stitching Lucy closed. She did this with amazing speed, years of practice, I suppose. The Frau sewed up Lucy as her dead eyes stared at the creature's habit, the fabric unstained by blood or gore. When she finished, Frau Perchta sat in her chair once more and motioned me over. I didn't want to go. I had just seen the woman kill one of my best friends, but my mom pushed me towards her and gave me a nervous look that said all it needed to. I approached her chair on rubbery legs, trying not to look at Lucy's bloated form as I passed her. The Frau held out her hand, the blue fingers streaked with gore, and I heard the clink of coins. I held out my own shaky hand, not wanting her to touch me, and she let 4 large gold coins fall into my hand. They too were bloodied, my gift holding its own little warning as she offered it to me. "You are such a good child. Know that I am pleased by your charity and your pure heart. Fear not. I will take care of that one," she said, indicating Lucy. "But you will need to make the proper excuses," she said to my mother and father. They both nodded and shunted me up to bed, my numb fingers still gripping the coins. I don't know how I managed to sleep after all that, but as the adrenaline wore off, I found my eyes growing heavy, and it was morning before I knew it. I expected to find Lucy in my room, fast asleep in her blankets, but she and her things were all gone. Her bags had been taken away, her bedding and her clothes were missing, and when I went downstairs, the living room was spotless. My parents were in the kitchen, their garb from the night before nowhere to be seen. My mother was on the phone with the police, filing a missing persons report. Her voice held nothing but honest emotion, and that's likely why nothing was ever said about the incident, other than regret. She left in the night, officer. We woke up to find her things gone and the front door open. Well, she had been feeling homesick, but we didn't think she'd actually run away. We've searched for her since dawn, since my husband noticed she was missing. No, not a sign of her. Yes, I called her mother to let her know, and they're on their way back now. Yes, please, officer. If you find anything, let us know. Thank you so much. She hung up the phone and sat with my father at the table, both of them looking at me. Sweetie, we need to talk about what happened last night. They told me everything. She told me an old story about how Frau Perchta would reward good children and punish those who were willful. Mom told me that she had seen her sister punished in just that same way, the same way Lucy had been. The body and the mess gone before morning, but not forgotten, and certainly not gone forever. They found her body a few months later, buried in a snowdrift. It was one of the reasons that I left the community when I was old enough. The police might not know what happened to her, but I did, and the community certainly did. When the coroner found sticks and rocks sewn into her, the community knew that my mother had raised one of the willful ones. I had hoped that by leaving, I would be able to free myself of the traditions of my people, but when the Frau arrived at my door on my first feast away from home, I knew that there would be no escaping her. She looked at me, her eyes full of pity and resolve. You will have to do the same. This is your life now. It won't end just because you leave it. The Frau is our burden, the gift given by my family generations ago, and she cannot be escaped. When you have children of your own, you must remember this night and raise them to respect the white. You know the consequences of failure now. If the police ask you what happened to Lucy, just tell them the truth. Tell them you haven't seen her since last night, and leave it at that. And so I did. So I have been doing for years now. I'm a married woman with children of my own now, and I have raised them to both revere and fear the yearly visits of Frau Perchta. My children are good kids, but I will never make the same mistake my mother made on that day when I was young. I will never allow outsiders to stay at my house for the holiday. I will never let my children know the dark secret that I keep inside. Whew. I had a little bit too much to eat during that last story. I think pretty soon I'll be settling in for a long Christmas nap and, getting home when I feel a little bit more able to drive. But of course, not before I finish your Christmas tales. There's still a few more to go, and as my present to you, I want you to get all that you can out of these fine stories. I'm sure that most of us have heard the Christmas Carol story, where Ebenezer Scrooge is visited by ghosts and has a change of heart and a change of life. Well, what happened to the Scrooge in some of those memories? What happened to the people in some of those futures where they just didn't exist anymore? What would happen to you if you were in someone else's future that was suddenly changed? Let's find out, shall we? As we look at the ghost of Christmas Never. Okay, so this is really weird, and I don't know what to do about it. I don't even know if anyone will ever read this, but it's all I can do to keep my mind intact. I've been wandering the streets for weeks, unable to re-enter my home. I've never been what you'd call a motivated person. I was a solid C student in high school, college dropout, and I work at Kinko's full-time to pay my shoddy one-bedroom apartment rent and my meager food bills. I was never hurting, not really. I just didn't really have much of a direction, I suppose. My parents bemoaned the way I live constantly. They tell me I had such potential when I was a kid. I had good grades, my writing was so talented, I had so many opportunities. I excelled at baseball and track. I've probably still got some spelling bee trophies I won throughout elementary school somewhere around here. The world was my oyster, and it seemed like middle school would be a continuation of my excellence. Then, I discovered World of Warcraft. I know, it's a cop-out, but the game kind of took over my life. Suddenly, I didn't care about tests. I didn't care about extracurriculars, and if I still wrote, it was fanfic about the game that I loved. This affair started in 6th grade, and my parents are probably still kicking themselves for paying my subscription fees. Suddenly, my own priorities seemed to be doing my chores so I could get enough allowance to keep paying for my monthly subscriptions. I would spend hours online, which only worsened as I grew older. I was actually playing World of Warcraft when it happened. I had gotten off of work an hour ago, and I had hit the game as soon as I got home. My guild was raiding, and I was settling in for 8 hours of solid gaming. I was off the next day, so I could sleep tomorrow away if I wanted to. What did I have to get up for anyway? All my friends were online, so sleeping until I finally felt like getting up sounded pretty good to me. When the weird light started emanating from behind me, I thought it was my lava lamp at first. I started hearing someone talking, someone behind me as opposed to over my headset, and I glanced behind me to see a strange, wavering portal. It was like looking too far down the road on a hot day, and it seemed to shimmer over the dirty floor to my bedroom. There were 2 people standing in it. One of them was a tall man in a suit and a top hat, casting his hand to me as though showing something to the other. The other was a child, barely older than 12, looking confused in his pajamas. My eyes grew a little wider. That kid was me.
See what your future holds if you stay on this path. Your dreams, your ambitions, all gone as you wallow in perpetual stagnation.
The younger me looked around, seeming horrified, before begging the man to take him home.
As you wish.
And suddenly, they were gone. I sat there, listening to my guildmaster ask if I was still there. What the hell had that been? It had ended as quickly as it had begun, and left me thinking that something otherworldly had just happened. I had seen myself at the age just before I had given up, but I had no memories of what had happened. No one had ever visited me and taken me on a Dickensian look into my future. It had never happened, and yet I had seen myself seeing me, and the feeling of horror on that young face had been startling. I tried to get back into the game, but the thoughts of that little kid looking at me with real horror kept distracting me. A few minutes later, I told them I felt sick and took myself off to bed. I lay there thinking about what I had seen, wondering if it had all been a dream or a delusion or what the hell had happened. The look on the youngster's face had been deeply troubling, and I just couldn't shake it. What had that even been? Why didn't I remember it? I went to sleep thinking of these things, and they followed me into my dreams. I slept poorly that night. The strangeness started the next day. I had woken up at 1 o'clock in the afternoon and sat down with a bowl of cereal. I was ready to play for the day. I had sort of put the event of the night before out of my mind and decided that it was just something I had dreamed up. I had felt sick last night and dreamed about seeing a ghostly figure. My brain knew otherwise, but I had gotten pretty good at deluding myself after convincing myself that things were fine for so long. It started with something easily overlooked. I logged in and started trying to find a group for one of the lower-level characters I was playing. I wanted to run a specific dungeon, but they seemed to ignore me when I asked to join their group. I thought it was kind of rude, but the longer it went on, the madder I got about it. I raged about it in chat, but it also went uncommented on there. I changed characters, thinking maybe it was a glitch, but I was still roundly ignored by everyone. After about an hour, I gave up and logged off. I tried playing other games I enjoyed, but no one seemed to see or comment on anything I said in-game. It was like I was invisible. I went down to the corner store to get something to eat, a pack of ramen and a sandwich, and I had to smack the counter a few times before the guy behind it would look at me. He was stocking cigarettes, but I know he saw me. I asked him why he didn't acknowledge me sooner, but he just told me to have a nice day and wandered off. After I ate, I went back to bed, and I lay there fuming. I wish, now, that I had only been limited to being overlooked in games. The next day I had to work. I got up at 9, showered, ate breakfast, and put my uniform on. I thought about calling in. I was still kind of put out from yesterday, but I decided against it. Maybe a day of work would make me feel a little better. People would have to notice me if I was at work, right? I grabbed my keys and headed out to Kinko's. It started to become more noticeable when I got to work. At first, a coworker wouldn't say hi to me. Then it was time to clock in, but the time clock refused to let me clock in with my thumbprint. I went to Mary, my boss, but she just ignored me. I shouted and pushed things off her desk, and only that seemed to really draw her attention. She asked what the hell I was doing, and when I told her I couldn't clock in, she asked who I was. I looked at her, unbelieving. I've worked at this Kinko's for 7 years. Mary's the one who hired me. I told her my name after she started getting rude about it, and she typed it in and just shook her head. Sorry, looks like you don't work at this location. Are you supposed to start at the Francis Park store today or something? I cut her off, though. I told her that I had worked here for 7 years. I told her we'd interacted almost daily since I started. I had literally been to her house, swam in her pool, gone to high school with her son. She stared at me blankly and said she had no idea who I was. She suggested that I check with the Francis Park store, but told me I would have to leave. After a little more arguing, she threatened to call the cops if I didn't leave immediately. Thinking back on it, she wasn't even really angry when she threatened to call the police. She spoke to me in that way you might boredly tell someone that it's time they left. She never looked up from her work, simply wanting the momentary nuisance of me to go away. When I left, she never even acknowledged it. I went home in a rage, not understanding what was going on, but my mind kept returning to that kid and the man in the top hat. Maybe it was the time of the year, but the whole thing made me feel very Scrooge-like. Had not Ebenezer Scrooge been shown his future by a ghost? Perhaps I was the future yet to come. I shook my head, trying to get it out of my brain. The whole thing was just too weird, too Dickensian. The mood wasn't helped by the reception I received online. People ignored me again, the very thing I had already been mad about. And even worse, some of them asked where I was. They claimed they hadn't seen me in a few days and were starting to get worried. Others claimed they thought they had seen me online yesterday, but they couldn't be sure. I told them I was here, asked what sort of game they thought they were playing, but they didn't respond. I finally logged out and went to get some takeout. If I couldn't drown my sorrows in online games, I would drown them in cheap Chinese food. When I reached for the door, though, there was a moment of vertigo as my hand slipped through the knob. I pulled it away like a kid who's touched a hot stove, but when I reached again, my hand gripped it this time, and I turned it normally. I looked at it for a few seconds, knowing what I had seen, but not quite believing it. I closed the door behind myself, wondering vacantly if I'd be able to get back in again. As I walked down the road, the garish lights of Christmas twinkled about me. It suddenly hit me that it was December 21st, and I hadn't bought a single thing for my parents. I hadn't gotten them anything the year before that either, but it was weird that they hadn't called to ask if I'd be around for Christmas. As I walked down the sidewalk, people avoided me easily, none of them so much as grunting at me, or excusing themselves, or telling me to get the hell out of the way. It was the holidays, but people usually told you to fuck yourself when you got in their way in my town. I was beginning to feel unwanted, if not a little unseen, as I slumped my shoulders and continued on. The trip was ultimately fruitless anyway. I stood in line at the restaurant, but the guy behind me stepped up to order instead as I approached the counter. The guy at the register took no notice of me, and instead began to take his order. I shouted at them, banging on the counter, but they just ignored me. What the hell was going on? I shouted at the others in line, but no one so much as looked at me. Finally, I just turned to leave, reaching out to catch the door as it swung shut. The bar passed right through my hands, and I slid through the glass front as I stumbled out onto the street. I ran then, my frantic running attracting no attention. I wish it had been that easy to pass back into my apartment, but I never found it. I ran to my apartment complex, but my apartment was gone. The space was empty, a blank wall that had never had a door on it, but had indeed had a door on it barely an hour ago. No matter how much I slammed my hands against the wall, it refused to return to reality. After an hour of just leaning there, hoping for something, I turned and left. I've been on the streets ever since. I don't even know how long I've been here, but I see the lights and know that it's that time of year again. I walk the streets alone. No one notices me. No one speaks to me. It's as if I don't even exist. I've been living in the library that I used to go to when I was a kid, reading books and trying to muster the strength to write this. You see, it's like that scene out of the movie Ghost. If I concentrate very, very hard, I can turn a page or strike a key on the computer. It gets easier the more I practice, but it takes a toll sometimes. I've been typing my story for quite some time now, hiding it on the librarian's computer so she won't delete it. It's almost ready to post now, and I'm hoping that unlike my past friends, someone can see my final message. I've wondered long and hard, you see, about what happened to the characters in A Christmas Carol after Scrooge had his change of heart. Did they cease to exist? Or did they live in this strange limbo like me? I wonder what my past self saw that was really so terrible. Am I such a nightmare that he felt he had to change his future so drastically? Did he return to the past and hurt himself in response to seeing how badly things were going for me? I don't know. I don't even know why I'm telling any of you this. I suspect it's simply for the purpose of telling you that I existed once, as much as I ever existed. When I'm finally allowed to be no more, I want someone to know that I was more, or less, I guess, than the ghost I am today.
Oh, no, I wasn't asleep yet. It's just, resting my eyes a little during that last story. But I'm awake. I'm willing and able to finish this out strong with one last story of our Christmas tales. While not necessarily a Christmas story, I think it's a good one to end off on, and I think you'll agree with me. What with all of us beginning to think of our New Year's resolutions and what we'd like to see from the coming year. So, let's have a look at today's story and think about it the next time you claim it's going to be a new year and a new you.
It felt like such a harmless resolution. Everyone makes them, after all. I simply wanted a new me for the new year. Last year had been a joke in every sense of the word. With quarantine, we had been locked down inside for months. The city nearly shut down completely. But we had all been a little hopeful at the beginning that we could use this time to our advantage. I would use it to better myself. I'd learn a new skill. I'd write my book. I'd never go back to my crappy job again. In that time of uncertainty, we all settled in with high hopes of coming out with something better than we'd started. Turns out, I only managed one of those things. I would never go back to my crappy job because I was laid off halfway through the year. I spent the next 6 months wallowing in self-pity, watching Netflix and adding quarantine weight to my belt. My exercise plan went by the wayside. My plans to better myself didn't seem to matter. And as my wife started her new job at the grocery store, her job had also let her go, I settled into depression like a crab in its shell. As I sat on the couch, one show after another rolling past, I saw little reason to do much of anything. When Christmas rolled around, I realized it had been 9 months since I'd done anything of value, and that was when the depression set in. I spent Christmas morning in a funk, sitting in my sweatpants and watching our kids open their meager gifts. My wife sat in the armchair opposite me, looking tired but happy with the gifts she had gotten them. She'd bought everything, paid for everything, because I was too lazy and unmotivated to do much of anything. Every now and then, I would catch these little looks from her, little disappointed looks tinged with sadness. All I could do was wallow in my sadness, though, not sure what I could do to change it. When New Year's came, I just stayed in bed. I didn't feel worthy to join the others for their midnight toasts or their energetic countdowns. As I heard them count down, I closed my eyes and felt myself make more of a wish than a resolution. 5, I wanted a new me for the new year. 4, a better me. 3, for them. 2, someone they could be proud of. 1, someone who wouldn't let them down. Happy New Year! I dozed off to the sound of them ringing in the new year, hoping I would awake to find that I'd found the strength to make my resolution a reality. I woke up to the smell of eggs and bacon, pancakes and syrup, and hearty laughter from downstairs. They had started breakfast without me. The first breakfast of the year was a tradition of ours. Why wouldn't they? I hadn't exactly been there the last few months. Why would now be any different? Why not now? Why not make good on my resolution? I got dressed in something other than sweatpants and came downstairs to the laughter of my family. Someone was sitting at the head of the table, though, telling a story that had all of them in stitches, and I felt a little miffed as I came to the foot of the stairs. Who was this guy? He sounded a little familiar, but I couldn't place him right away. They hadn't woken me up to eat, and now there was some stranger in my house. What the hell was going on? Lisa, why didn't you tell me we had company? But Lisa said nothing. She had eyes only for this charismatic stranger who was sitting in my chair. Brad? Janet? Did anyone save me any pancakes? I'm as hungry as... So glad you woke up to make these pancakes this morning, dear, Lisa said, raising her orange juice glass to the man at the head of the table. What can I say? The guy said, and as I moved around to confront him, I took a step back in surprise. I was as hungry as a bear this morning. It was me. I was sitting at the head of the table. I was still the same as I was now, but I looked different somehow. My face was shaved, my hair was cut down from the greasy tangles it was now, and I had dressed in some normal clothes. I was wearing an apron, smudged with flour and speckled with grease. More than that, though, I seemed to exude a healthy glow. I was a mess, but I could get better. I was filled with an energy that let people know I was changed. I was full of vigor, full of life, full of pep. I kept yelling at them as they ate, trying to get someone's attention, but they all just kept eating, kept laughing, kept living as though I didn't exist. I made a joke then, my family's laughter the backdrop for the screams that came ripping up my throat as I slowly lost my mind. When he picked up their plates and walked them to the kitchen, I followed him. I kept jabbering at the back of his head, the catharsis the only thing that mattered now. I asked him what the hell he thought he was doing. I yelled at him to get out of my house and leave my family alone, and to stop pretending to be me. He stood there, washing dishes as I screamed at him, and when I was done, he just laughed. When are you gonna wake up? I'm you now, he said, turning around to look at me, my own face smiling back in the face of my confusion, and I have no intention of going anywhere. I took a step away from him, my anger turning to confusion. What are you? I gasped, backing into the counter as I tried to get away from this strange homunculus. I'm you, the best you, and soon I'll be the only you. I stayed for about a month just to watch over them, just to watch him. He was the perfect husband, though, the perfect father, the perfect man. He went to my son's Little League games. He went to my daughter's band recitals. He remembered my wife's birthday, remembered her favorite food, and he made time for her every day. He got out and found a job working at a warehouse, and after a month they talked about making him an assistant manager. He cooked dinners and read bedtime stories, and was the husband and father that my family deserved. And I was there to watch it all as my family gathered around him and became the focal point once again. After a month of living like a ghost in my own house, I left and never looked back. I began to walk one day and just didn't stop for a while. I expected to disappear, to stop existing, but I found that the opposite was true. The farther I walked, the more I began to feel alive again. I hadn't noticed while I'd been watching my family live with this strange man, but I hadn't felt the urge to eat or drink that whole time. The farther I moved from my house, the more I realized I was becoming hungrier and thirstier. I had brought my wallet with me out of habit, and the cheeseburger and fries I bought tasted heavenly. I was able to use my debit card and my credit card for a little while, but after a few months they stopped working, and I was forced to work odd jobs in order to feed and clothe myself. By some stroke of luck, I had purchased some things I would need to survive in my new homeless lifestyle before my credit card was turned off. It wasn't much, but it helped me get far enough away from my old home that people could see me again. It's proximity that seemed to trigger it. At least that's what Malcolm thinks. Sorry, I got a little ahead of myself there. About 6 months ago, a year into my journey, I met a homeless guy at a soup kitchen, and we started talking about our past lives. I told him how I'd left my family, making it sound like my wife had left me for another man, but he just smiled and shook his head. He said he had a similar story. his wife leaving him for someone else, but it wasn't just anyone. She left me for another me, just like your wife. I was speechless, but when I asked how he could know that, he told me a very familiar story. Malcolm had been a company man. He had worked long hours, holidays, birthdays, missing most of the important memories from his child's lives. One of those special events was a particular vacation where his son had drowned while he was at a board meeting. His wife and daughters were distraught. John had been the baby of his family, and they had all doted on him. But Malcolm had only thrown himself harder into his work to hide his grief. One night, New Year's Eve actually, his wife had come to him and said that she felt like she was in a shell of a marriage and that she needed a partner more than a bank account. I stood looking down from my office on the 12th floor and let my grief wash over me at last. I wished for a better me, for the man my wife deserved, and I suppose I got it. When I woke up at my desk the next day, I was like Ebenezer Scrooge after the ghosts had come to visit him. I rushed home, wanting to apologize for never being there for them, but I was already there. I was sitting at the table. I was talking with them and telling them that I was going to turn over a new leaf. And when I saw myself looking through the window, I just smiled at me with the biggest shit-eating grin I could muster. Malcolm, the new Malcolm, had sold his shares of the company, giving ownership to the board, and left a rich man. He had taken Malcolm's family away, moving somewhere he could retire and show them the attention they deserved. Malcolm had never seen them again. He had haunted his empty house for a few months, unsure of where they had gone, but eventually the cops had come and found him squatting there. They could see me again, now that my family was gone, and they rousted me from the house. I told them who I was, but they just laughed at me and told me to keep dreaming. I showed them my ID, my credit cards, and they threw me in jail, believing I was a thief. I spent 3 years in prison for petty theft before getting out and hitting the road. That was 20 years ago, and I've been on the move ever since. I travel with Malcolm now. We found 2 others since we set out, too. They seem drawn to us somehow. Our shared grief and sense of strangeness seems to call to them. They both have similar stories, similar wishes, and it seems that their wishes also came true. So give some thought before you wish for a new self in the new year. Your new self may just make your old self obsolete.
And just like that jolly old elf himself, it's time for me to dash away. Until next time. But don't fret, I'll be back again with more cozy horror, and I do hope that from my home to yours, you have enjoyed our Christmas programming. It's always such a wonderful gift to speak to you all during my live streams and read your comments and just know how much my stories mean to you, how much they mean to your families, some of you, because some of you guys let your kids listen to this or your relatives, and I don't know if I'm that brave, but I appreciate it anyway. But anyway, I always appreciate hearing from you, and I love you all, and I'm glad that you could come and spend a little holiday time with me, Dr. Plague. Till next time, this is Dr. Plague, wishing you a very Merry Christmas and a spooky New Year.